A crimson dress soaked in another man's blood, one bullet left in a derringer, and a stranger walking up the road toward her with his hand on a Colt. She raised the gun, she pointed it at his chest, and she said, "Take another step and I will shoot you. I have one round and I will use it." What she did not know was that the man in front of her had not heard a woman cry out in 8 long years, and what was about to happen on that mountain pass would change the rest of both their lives. This is the story of the woman on Crow's Pass and the three brothers who answered her scream. The first bullet left her derringer at 5 minutes past dawn. The second one stayed in the chamber, and Eleanor Ashford pressed her back hard against the splintered wood of the overturned coach and listened to her own breathing, slow, slower, the way her father had taught her when she was 9 years old and frightened of thunder. Slow your breath, daughter, and the world slows with it. The world was not slowing. The world was a smear of pine shadow and pale October sun, and the iron stink of blood soaking into the front of her crimson traveling dress. The blood was not hers. The blood belonged to a man named Coleman Bevins, the stage driver who had stopped to water the team an hour before sunrise and who had taken a bullet in the throat before he could finish his second cup of coffee. The blood also belonged in smaller measure to the man she had shot. He had come around the side of the coach with a Bowie knife and a smile that promised slower things than dying, and she had shot him in the upper thigh because that was where her aunt had told her years ago to aim a derringer if she ever needed to aim it at all. A man cannot chase you if his femoral artery is open. A man cannot do anything if his femoral artery is open. The man had fallen. The man had stopped smiling. The man was now dead behind the wheel of the coach, and she had walked past his body without looking down, the way a person walks past something they do not yet have the strength to understand. Two of the four men who had attacked the stage had bolted into the timber when she came up shooting. One was dead. That left a fourth somewhere in the trees, and he was the biggest of them, broad as a barn door, and she could not hear him, which meant he was still hunting. The derringer in her gloved hand held one round. She had 2,400 miles of railroad and wagon track and frozen river crossings behind her. She had a letter folded into the lining of her bodice promising a husband in Silver Creek, a small house, a porch, a kitchen with a window that faced east. She had her mother's gold cameo at her throat. She had one bullet. She had nothing else. A pine cone fell somewhere to her left. She turned the derringer toward the sound. Her hand was steady. Her hand should not have been steady. She was 24 years old, and she had grown up in a house with marble floors and a music tutor, and her hands had no right to be this still. But her Aunt Margaret had drilled her in a back garden in Beacon Hill, summer after summer, year after year, with a small pistol and a row of glass bottles set on the wall, and her aunt had said, "Every time Eleanor Fear is a sound the body makes. You may listen to it. You will not obey it." Eleanor was listening. She was not obeying. A second sound, closer, a hoof perhaps striking stone, then a man's voice low and unhurried, and from a distance calling out something she could not catch through the ringing in her ears. She crouched lower. She lifted the derringer with both hands. And then she heard it, a scream, her own, tearing out of her chest before she had decided to let it. A sound that had been building under her ribs for 3 days, since the moment the first rider had appeared on the ridge at the wrong hour with the wrong shape of rifle across his saddle, and she opened her mouth and let it out, and the mountain caught the sound and threw it back from the high rocks, and she screamed because she had nothing else left to throw. If you are listening tonight, my friend, sit a moment with that. A young woman alone on a mountain in the autumn of 1878 with one bullet and the body of an honest stage driver and the blood of a wicked man drying on her dress, screaming into the timber because she has come to the end of what a person can carry by herself. Before we go any further into the story of how she got there and what waited for her on the other side of that scream, do me a small kindness if you are new here. Tap that subscribe button. I tell a frontier story every week, a story about the men and women who built the American West with their bare hands and broke themselves and rebuilt themselves in the doing of it. And while you are down there, drop a comment. Tell me where you are listening from tonight. A porch in Tennessee, a shop bench in Michigan, a truck cab somewhere out on the long roads of West Texas. I read every one. Now, back to the mountain, back to the scream. Because three men were riding up that pass at exactly the wrong moment, and one of them had not heard a woman cry out in 8 long years. Hollis Whitlock heard her first. He was 31 years old, and he was riding lead on a string of 4 pack horses loaded with the autumn furs the brothers had carried down to Helena and traded for cash money and powder and 100 pounds of coffee and a bolt of red flannel because Ezra had said winter was coming hard and a man could not have too much red flannel in a winter. Hollis had let his brother say it. Hollis had let his brother decide. Hollis did not much care anymore what was in the packs. Hollis cared that the horses were fed and the trail was clear and the brothers got home before the first real snow, and that was the size of what he cared about, and it had been the size of what he cared about for 8 years. He drew rein when the sound reached him. He sat very still in the saddle. The wind moved in the lodgepole pines above the trail. A jay called once and went silent. Behind him, 50 yards back, Garrett pulled up his sorrel. Without a word, Garrett had ridden 3 years as a scout for the cavalry out of Fort Ellis in the early 70s, riding the rough country south of the Yellowstone in the seasons when the Sioux were moving, and Garrett knew when a man stopped without speaking. Behind Garrett, Ezra eased his bay around a fallen log and saw both brothers halted and reached back and laid his palm on the stock of the Henry rifle in the scabbard at his knee. None of them spoke. Hollis tilted his head 1/4 inch. The sound came again, fainter, this time a thinning of itself, but unmistakable. A woman, crying out, high up the pass and to the south beyond the bend where the trail crossed the shoulder of the ridge above Crow Creek. 8 years. 8 years ago, he had heard a sound like that, and he had been 3 days' ride away when he heard it, and by the time he reached the cabin, the sound had stopped. By the time he reached the cabin, his daughter was wrapped in a blanket that was the wrong color, and his wife was sitting on the floor with her hands in her lap, and Ezra, 19 years old and bleeding from a gash above his eye, was trying to tell him in words that would not come out of his mouth what had happened. Hollis had not heard a woman scream from that day to this. He had heard wind. He had heard the bawl of a cow in calving. He had heard his brothers raise their voices once or twice over cards. He had not heard a woman. There had not been a woman to make the sound. Hollis. It was Garrett. Quiet, just behind him. Hollis lifted his hand off the saddle horn and let it settle on the grip of the Colt at his hip. He did not draw. I heard it, he said. Could be a trap, Garrett said. Bandits will run a woman out to scream and then come down on the riders who come to help. Could be, Hollis said. And could be a woman, Ezra said, soft from the rear of the line. Hollis turned his horse half a step. He looked at his middle brother. Garrett's face was sun-browned and lean and held nothing. It did not want to hold, but his eyes had already moved past Hollis up the trail, sorting the ground and the timber and the angles a man might come from. Ezra, behind him, was paler than Garrett, finer at the bone, with the long, careful hands of the boy he had once been when he had thought he might be a lawyer instead of a man on a mountain. Both of them were waiting for Hollis to choose. Hollis chose. Garrett, you peel left, take the timber high. Ezra, you stay with the packs and bring them up slow when you hear my whistle. I take the trail. Hollis, Ezra said, what? If it is a woman, Hollis did not answer for a moment. If it is a woman, he said, then it is a woman. He nudged his horse forward. The trail to Crow's Pass climbs in long, lazy curves through the lodgepole and then breaks out above the timber onto a saddle of grass and bare rock where a man can see 90 miles on a clear day. It was not a clear day. There was a haze of wood smoke from somewhere west, maybe a homestead burning / and the sun rode low and yellow through it, and the shadows on the trail were long and false. Hollis came up the last curve at a walk, the Colt now in his right hand, and the reins gathered short in his left, and he came around the shoulder of the ridge and saw the coach. It was on its side. A Concord painted dark green with the gilt mostly worn off the panels, 6-horse team, the lead pair gone, the wheelers cut loose and standing trembling in the timber off the trail. The driver was face down in the road with his hands still curled around the stock of a shotgun he had not lived to fire. There was a second body, a man Hollis did not know, half under the rear wheel with one boot off and a Bowie knife on the ground 6 feet from his hand and a dark wet patch high on his right leg that told the whole story of how he had died. And there was a woman. She was crouched against the upturned undercarriage of the coach, half hidden by the spokes of the broken wheel, and she had a derringer in both hands, and the derringer was pointed at his chest. She was small. That was the first thing he registered. Small, in a way that had nothing to do with height and everything to do with how a person held themselves when they had not slept and had not eaten and had decided somewhere in the last several hours that they were not going to live to see sundown. She was small the way a wounded bird is small in the hand, and her dress had once been a deep crimson, the color of the wine they used to bring out on Christmas Eve at his mother's table, and now the dress was the color of a wound, and there was blood across the bodice that he could see, and the time it took to draw one breath was not her own. Her eyes were the color of cornflower. That was the second thing he registered. He registered it, and then he set it aside because there was a derringer pointed at his chest. Ma'am, he said. He did not lower the Colt. He did not raise it. He let it ride loose at his side barrel toward the ground. Take another step, she said, and I will shoot you. Yes, ma'am. I have 1 round and I will use it. Yes, ma'am. There is a 4th man out there in the timber. No, there isn't. She blinked at him. The Derringer did not waver. I came up the south face on foot for the last quarter-mile, Hollis said, and I left my horse below the ridge. There is no 4th man on the timber side. If he was there, he has been gone 2 hours. I would have cut his sign. How would you know that? Because my brother behind me would have cut it before I did, and he has not whistled. He whistles when he cuts a fresh track. He has not whistled. She did not lower the gun. Who are you? She said. Hollis Whitlock. My brothers Garrett and Ezra are with me. We live half a day's ride further up the mountain. We came around the ridge because we heard you call out. Call out. Scream, ma'am. We heard you scream. I would not call a thing what it isn't. She did not lower the gun. She did, however, allow her shoulders to drop 1/4 of an inch. He saw it. He had been a man who watched things for a living. He saw the 1/4 inch. He spoke into it. Ma'am, I am going to put my pistol back in the holster, not because you have made me, because I cannot do anything useful for you with it in my hand. He did it slowly. The Colt went home. He let his hands hang loose at his sides where she could see them. His hands were the size of dinner plates, and they were marked with the long, pale scars of the forge, and they did not in any way look like the hands of a man with comforting intentions, and he knew it. I want to put my brother on the high ground above this trail, he said, before someone who is not me comes around that ridge. I am going to whistle for him now. If you would rather I did not whistle, say so, and I won't. She stared at him. Whistle, she said. He whistled. 2 short notes, then 1 long. From above the trail, 50 yards up through the timber, came a single note back. Garrett had heard. He'll come down once you say so, Hollis said. He won't come closer until you do. And the other one is with the pack string 1/4 mile down. He won't come up until I call. She lowered the Derringer, not all the way. She let it tip toward the dirt. The barrel angled away from him, but her finger was still inside the trigger guard and her knuckle was still white. He saw her see her own hand. He saw her notice, perhaps for the first time, that she had been holding it like that for some time. She put her left hand under her right and steadied them both. My name is Eleanor Ashford, she said. Mrs. Ashford. Miss Ashford. Miss Ashford. I was on the morning stage from Helena bound for Silver Creek. The driver was a man named Coleman Bevins. He had a wife in Bozeman and 3 sons. He stopped to water the horses, and 4 men came out of the timber, and they shot him, and they shot the gentleman traveling with me, and one of them came around the side of the coach with a knife. I had a Derringer in my sleeve. My aunt taught me how to use it. I shot him in the upper thigh because she said a man cannot chase you if his femoral artery is open. He fell down, and he died, and the other 2 ran. The 4th one, I do not know where the 4th one is. She said all of that in one breath. She said it the way a person says a list they have been rehearsing in their head for an hour, afraid of forgetting any of it, because the saying of it is the only proof left that any of it was real. Hollis nodded once. That is a clean accounting, he said. Thank you. Miss Ashford, may I come up to the coach? I want a seat of the driver. He may have people like you said, and I would like to bring him in proper if I can. She did not answer. She looked at the body of Coleman Bevins lying in the road, and her mouth made a small movement that was not a word. You may come up, she said. He came up. He moved slowly, the way he would move toward a horse that did not yet know him. He stepped around the dead man with the Bowie knife, and he did not look at the dead man. And he knelt by Coleman Bevins, and he turned him gently, and he closed the man's eyes with 2 fingers, and he laid him out on the road with the shotgun beside him, because that was the dignity he could give him. He stood. He looked at Eleanor Ashford. She was looking at him. How long since you ate? He said. I do not know. How long since you slept? I slept Tuesday night. I think it is Friday. It is Friday. Then Tuesday night. He whistled again. A different note. Down the trail from below the ridge came the answer. Ezra was coming up with the packs. Miss Ashford, Hollis said. I have a brother coming up from below. He is 27 years old. He is the gentlest man on this mountain, and he will not come within 10 feet of you unless you say he may. Garrett above us is the one with the rifle. He will come down when I call. I would like to make a fire and boil coffee and put some bread and bacon in front of you because you have not eaten since Tuesday, and the sun is going down in 4 hours, and we have to decide what we are doing with you before it does. Will you allow that? She looked at him for a long moment. You did not ask my business, she said. No, ma'am. Why? Because your business is your business, and I have not earned it. If you want to tell me, you tell me. If you do not, you do not. She looked away from him then. She looked at the body of Coleman Bevins on the road, and at the broken wheel of the coach, and at the line of the timber where the sun was sliding away, and she made a small sound in her throat that was not quite a sob and not quite anything else, and she said very quietly, I came out here to marry a man named Jeremiah Cole. Hollis went still. Down below on the trail, Ezra came around the bend with the pack string and he saw the coach and he stopped his horse. From above, Garrett came down through the timber with his rifle across his saddle bow, sliding his sorrel between the lodge poles, and he saw the coach and he stopped his horse. Neither of them spoke. Hollis kept his eyes on Eleanor Ashford. Miss Ashford, he said. Yes. Who told you to come? He did. He. Mr. Cole, he wrote me a letter. He wrote me 5 letters over the course of the spring and summer. My aunt brokered the agreement. The final letter set the date. It is here. She touched the front of her bodice where Hollis could see the corner of a folded paper showing above the line of black lace. It is dated the 14th of August of this year. He wrote that he would meet me at the Silver Creek Depot on the 3rd of October. Miss Ashford? Yes. He did not want to say it. He let himself stand there in the road in the long yellow light with a dead man at his feet and his brothers behind him on the trail, and he did not want to say it. But a man who would not say the hard thing to a woman who had asked for it was no kind of man, and his father had taught him that, and his father had died believing it. Jeremiah Cole, he said, has been dead since the 2nd week of July. He saw her hear it. He saw her not hear it. He saw her hear it again. He went up to the high country above the Marias to hunt elk, Hollis said. He went alone. He was not the kind of man who took company. He met a sow grizzly with 2 cubs on the 3rd day. They found him the following Tuesday. They buried him in the churchyard at Silver Creek on a Saturday. Reverend Pike said the words. Every soul in that town was at the burying. There is no man named Jeremiah Cole alive on this mountain or any mountain. He has been 3 months in the ground. She sat down. It was not a sitting, it was a giving way. Her knees folded and she sat down hard in the dirt of the trail in her crimson dress with her derringer still loose in her hand, and she did not cry. She did not make a sound. She sat in the road and she stared at the ground and she breathed in and out the way a person breathes when the body has decided to keep doing the work, even though the mind has stopped asking it to. Hollis Whitlock looked down at her, and something happened inside him that had not happened in 8 years. He could not have named it. He would not have tried. It was not pity, although there was pity in it. It was not tenderness, although tenderness was in it too. It was the 1/4-inch shift of a stone that has sat in one place for a very long time. The small grinding sound when a thing that has not moved finally moves, and a man inside himself feels the shape of his own chest change 1/4 inch and does not yet understand that everything past this moment will be measured against it. He went down on one knee in the road. He did not touch her. Miss Ashford, he said, we are going to get you on a horse and we are going to take you up the mountain to our place. We have a spare room. There is a stove. There is hot water. There is a door that locks from the inside. Tomorrow morning we will ride to Silver Creek and we will sit with Reverend Pike and we will figure out together how a letter came to you under the name of a man 3 months dead. Tonight you eat and you sleep behind a locked door. Is that acceptable? She did not answer. He let the silence sit. Miss Ashford, yes. Is that acceptable? She lifted her head. The cornflower eyes were dry. He had expected tears. There were no tears. There was something underneath the place where tears live, and that was worse, and he recognized it because he had carried it himself. Mr. Whitlock, she said, Hollis. My given name is Hollis. Mr. Whitlock, why are you doing this? He did not answer for a long moment. Because I could, he said. He stood, he turned, and he raised one hand, and Garrett came down out of the timber, and Ezra came up from the trail, and the brothers gathered around the wreck of the Concord coach in the long October light, and Hollis Whitlock told his brothers in 5 sentences what had happened on Crow's Pass, and the brothers listened, and when he was done, Garrett swung down from his sorrel and went to Coleman Bevins and lifted the dead driver in his arms like a sleeping child and carried him to a level patch of ground beside the trail, and Ezra produced a folding shovel from the packs, and the brothers buried Coleman Bevins under a cairn of river stone before the sun touched the ridge. They left the second man where he had fallen. The mountain would take him. The mountain took men like that eventually, one way or another. Garrett caught the Wheeler horses out of the timber and led them back. Ezra sorted through the wreckage of the coach and pulled out what could be saved. There was a small leather valise with the initials EA stamped in gilt on the lid. There was a tin lockbox that rattled. There was a carpet bag with a tortoiseshell comb on top of the folded linens and a wool cloak the color of slate and a wooden case the size of a man's hand that Ezra opened and found a daguerreotype of a man and a woman seated with a small girl of perhaps 8 standing between them, one hand on the woman's shoulder, the woman wearing a brooch at her throat that Ezra recognized at once as the cameo at Eleanor Ashford's throat. He closed the case and he set it gently in the valise. He did not show it to his brother. Hollis lifted Eleanor onto his own horse. He did not ask, he did not negotiate, he simply put his hands at her waist and he lifted her, and she did not weigh what a grown woman should weigh, and she made no sound, and he set her in his saddle, and he wrapped his bison robe around her shoulders. The bison robe had been his father's. It was the warmest thing the Whitlock cabin owned. The leather of it was the color of dark molasses, and it smelled of the cedar chest where it had lived for 8 years, and Eleanor Ashford pulled it close around her and looked at no one. When his hands touched her waist, she felt something pass through her that she had no name for. She did not look at him. He did not look at her. They rode out. The trail up to the Whitlock cabin from Crow's Pass climbs 9 miles through Lodgepole and then Douglas Fir and then a long upper meadow where the bunch grass had already gone gold for the season, and the brothers rode it in, the order they always rode it, Garrett on point, Hollis behind him, leading the horse with Eleanor on it, and Ezra at the rear with the pack string. They did not talk. They had been brothers for a very long time, and there were stretches of country they had ridden in silence so many times the silence had become a kind of speech. The sun went down behind the ridge while they were still in the upper timber. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 20 minutes. Eleanor pulled the bison robe up over her hair. She did not cry. She had not cried. What she did somewhere in the third hour of the ride was begin to shake, not from cold. The robe was warm. She shook the way a person shakes when the body finally understands that the thing it was afraid of is over, and the shake came up out of her bones and out of her hands and out of her teeth, and Hollis Whitlock, riding at the head of the horse she was on, heard her teeth, and he did not turn around. He kept his eyes on the trail. He did not turn around because he understood that a woman who has decided not to cry in front of three strange men does not want the three strange men to know she is shaking. He gave her that. He gave her the pretense. He rode on. A man keeps his word. That was the phrase his father had said to him so many times in the building of the cabin and the breaking of the first horses and the burying of his mother in 1867, that the phrase had become a thing Hollis no longer thought, only heard the way a man hears his own breath. A man keeps his word. He had not given her a word yet, but he had taken her up onto his horse and wrapped her in his father's robe, and that was a kind of word, and he would keep it. The cabin came into view at full dark. It sat in a clearing of perhaps 3 acres in the bowl of the upper meadow, with the timber close on 3 sides and Crow Creek running along the 4th. The main house was 2 stories of squared lodgepole and chinked clay, with a stone chimney his father had laid, and a porch his father had built, and a roof his father had nailed down a year before Hollis was born. To the east of the main house stood the forge, low and dark, with the brick chimney showing pale against the black timber. To the west stood the horse barn, and beyond the barn the cured meat shed, and beyond the meat shed the small white-painted picket of a place where 2 graves lay under a single Douglas fir tree, the fir tree planted by his own hand, the graves marked with 2 slabs of granite Hollis himself had cut and dressed in his own forge in the spring of 1870 and never spoken about since. She did not see the graves in the dark. He did not show her. He helped her down from the horse at the porch. Garrett had ridden ahead and lit a lamp in the kitchen and stoked the stove and put coffee on, and the windows of the cabin glowed amber in the cold, and the smell of wood smoke and cedar and old leather met her at the door, and she walked into the front room of the Whitlock cabin like a person walking out of one life and into another and not yet understanding what had been left on the porch behind her. Up the stairs, Hollis said, "First door on the left. The room is made up. There is a basin and there is water in the pitcher. I will bring up hot water in a kettle in 10 minutes. The door has a bolt. The bolt works. I tested it last spring." Mr. Whitlock. Hollis. Mr. Whitlock. Whose room was this? He did not answer for a long moment. "My wife's," he said. He went into the kitchen and he did not look back. Eleanor Ashford climbed the stairs alone, the bison robe trailing behind her like the train of a wedding gown she had never thought to wear, and she opened the first door on the left, and she walked into a small, clean room with a single bed and a washstand and a chest of drawers and a window that faced east. On the chest of drawers stood a silver hairbrush with the initials SW engraved on the back. Beneath the hairbrush, set flat against the wood, lay a small piece of paper folded into quarters. The paper was the color of weak tea. It had not been disturbed in 8 years. She did not touch the paper. She stood in the middle of the room in her crimson dress, and she pulled the bison robe tight around her shoulders, and she heard from somewhere downstairs, very faint, a sound she did not at first recognize, a man weeping. Quietly, the way a man weeps who has not let himself weep in front of anyone for a long time, who has stepped outside the back kitchen door into the cold so that his brothers would not hear, and who did not know that a window was open 1 floor above him. Eleanor Ashford sat down on the edge of the bed of Sarah Whitlock, dead these 8 years, and she listened to the man weeping in the yard below. She did not yet know what she was hearing. She did not yet know that the cabin she had walked into had been silent of a certain kind of sound for 8 winters, that the sound a woman makes climbing a stair had not been heard in those rooms since the spring of 1870, that the bolt on the bedroom door had been tested last spring by a man who had not been able to tell himself why he was testing it. She did not know that there was a folded paper under a silver hairbrush 4 feet from her, and that the paper would, before the second snow of the season, change the shape of every life under the Whitlock roof. She did not know that a letter had been written about her in a tight, elegant hand in a townhouse on Beacon Hill in Boston 2 months before she had ever heard the name Jeremiah Cole, and that the letter had not been written by a husband because no husband had ever existed, and that the woman who had written the letter, while Eleanor sat now on a dead woman's bed in a mountain cabin in Montana Territory, was at that very hour boarding a westbound train. She did not know any of that. What she knew was that her hands were warm for the first time in 3 days, and that there was a man weeping in the yard below her window, and that she had one bullet left in a derringer she had slipped into the pocket of her dress when she undid the sleeve sheath, and that for reasons she could not yet name, she did not feel anymore that she would need it tonight. She lay back on the bed in her crimson dress. She did not bolt the door. She did not know why she did not bolt the door. She closed her eyes, and the weeping in the yard stopped, and somewhere on the mountain an owl spoke once and went silent, and Eleanor Ashford slept for the first time since Tuesday. Downstairs in the kitchen, Hollis Whitlock came back inside through the door and washed his face in the basin and did not look at his brothers, and his brothers did not look at him. Garrett poured coffee. Ezra set out 3 tin cups. The 3 Whitlock men sat at their father's table in the lamplight, and they did not speak for a long time. And then Ezra, who was the youngest and the gentlest and the one who saw things, said very quietly, Hollis, "What? That dress. I saw the dress. That dress costs more money than this whole mountain has seen in a year. That is Boston cloth. That is a Boston cut. That cameo at her throat is a Tiffany piece. She did not come out here because she had to. She came out here," Hollis said, "because someone wanted her to." Garrett looked up. "You think the letter was a lie," Garrett said. "I think Jeremiah Cole has been dead 3 months, and someone wrote that woman a letter in his name dated the middle of August. I think 4 men were waiting on Crow's Pass at 5 in the morning with rifles. I think Coleman Bevins did not drive that stage off route by accident. I think somebody paid for the route. I think somebody paid for the rifles. And I think when we go down to Silver Creek tomorrow and we send a wire to Boston, we are going to find that somebody is going to be surprised that the woman in the crimson dress is alive." The brothers sat with it. The fire in the stove ticked. "And what do we do," Garrett said, "when we find out who?" Hollis Whitlock lifted his tin cup, and he drank from it once slow, and he set it down, and he looked at his middle brother across the lamplight, and his eyes were the color of dark honey, and they had been empty for 8 years, and they were not empty now. "We send them word," he said, "that the woman they sent out here to die is under the roof of 3 Whitlock men, and we send them word that no one is taking her off this mountain." The lamp guttered. In the room above the kitchen in the bed that had not been slept in for 8 years, Eleanor Ashford turned in her sleep and did not wake. The first snow of the season began an hour before dawn. It came down soft and slow on the upper meadow and on the bison robe folded at the foot of the bed, and on the 2 granite slabs under the Douglas fir, and on the slate roof of the forge where Hollis Whitlock had laid his head against the cold brick of the chimney just before sunrise, and finally let himself say aloud in a voice no one heard, the thing he had not let himself say in 8 years. What he said was a name. He said it once. Then he went inside and put more wood on the stove because a woman who had not eaten since Tuesday was going to need a hot breakfast, and a man keeps his word, even the words he has not yet spoken aloud. Outside, the snow came down on Crow's Pass, and on the body of the man with the bowie knife, and on the cairn over Coleman Bevins, and on the long miles of trail that led down to Silver Creek, and on beyond Silver Creek to a railroad that ran east toward Boston, where a woman in a townhouse on Beacon Hill was at that very moment writing out a telegram in a tight, elegant hand and addressing it not to a man named Jeremiah Cole, who had been 3 months in the ground, but to a man named Theodore Hayes, who was already on a train. She woke to the smell of bacon. For a long moment, Eleanor Ashford did not know where she was. She lay on her back in a bed that was not hers, under a quilt that was not hers, in a room that smelled of cedar and wood smoke and something else, something older, something like dried lavender that had been folded into linen and forgotten for a long time. The window beside the bed was full of pale gray light, snow, There was snow on the sill. There had not been snow when she went to sleep. She turned her head on the pillow and saw the bison robe folded at the foot of the bed, and she remembered Crow's Pass, the dead driver, the man with the cornflower in his voice when he spoke to her. No, not cornflower. That was her eyes. His were the color of dark honey held up to a window, Hollis Whitlock. She sat up slowly. Her ribs hurt, her shoulders hurt, the small of her back hurt in the deep way a back hurts when a person has slept too long in one position, the way a body hurts when it has finally been allowed to stop. She was still in the crimson dress. The blood on the bodice had dried to brown. She put her bare feet on the floorboards, and the floorboards were warm. Someone had laid a long iron pipe down the wall from the kitchen stove below, the way they sometimes did in mountain houses to warm the rooms above. She had read about it once in a magazine in Boston. She had not believed it could work. The floorboards were warm. Someone had left a pitcher of hot water on the washstand. Someone had set a folded gray wool dress on the chair by the window. Plain, clean, a working dress, not hers. It would not fit her exactly. It would do. Someone had not knocked. She rose and she crossed the room, and she found that her legs would hold her, and she went to the chest of drawers where the silver hairbrush stood. She did not pick up the hairbrush. She did not touch the folded paper beneath it. She looked at the initials engraved on the back, S.W. Sarah Whitlock. The man had said it last night, plain as cold water. Whose room was this? My wife's. He had not embellished. He had not warned her. He had given her the truth, and then he had walked away into the kitchen, and she had climbed the stairs and slept in his dead wife's bed in a dress soaked with another man's blood, and she had slept the deepest sleep of her adult life. She did not understand it. She washed. She washed her face and her neck and her hands with the hot water, and she scrubbed under her nails with the small brush someone had left beside the basin, and the water in the basin turned the color of weak tea. She unbuttoned the crimson traveling dress, fingers slow on the small fabric-covered buttons, and she stepped out of it and folded it once and laid it across the chair. She did not look at the brown stain across the bodice. She would burn it later, or she would not. She did not know yet. She put on the gray wool dress. It was too long in the sleeve and too loose in the waist. It smelled faintly of cedar. It had been pressed. Someone had pressed it. Not last night, months ago, years ago perhaps. The dress had been laid in a chest and waited there for a woman to wear it, and a woman had not come, and now a woman had come. She did not put on her shoes. She went downstairs in stocking feet. The stairs creaked. She heard the conversation in the kitchen stop. By the time she reached the bottom of the stairs, the three Whitlock men were standing, all three of them standing the way men stand when their mother enters a room. Hollis at the head of the long pine table, Garrett at the wash basin, Ezra by the stove with a wooden spoon in his hand. None of them looked at the gray wool dress. All of them looked at the gray wool dress. Miss Ashford, Hollis said. Mr. Whitlock. You slept? I slept. There is coffee, there is bacon, and there are biscuits, and there is some of last summer's huckleberry preserve if you want it. Ezra cooks. None of us tells him how. Sit where you like. She sat at the corner of the table nearest the stove. Ezra slid a tin plate in front of her without speaking. The plate held 2 biscuits and 4 strips of bacon and a small dollop of dark purple preserve. The biscuits were hot. The bacon was crisp at the edge and soft in the middle, and the smell of it lifted something up out of her chest that she had not known was lying down there. She had not eaten a hot breakfast in 11 days. She ate. She ate slowly because her mother had taught her to eat slowly even when she was hungry, even when there was no one to see. She ate 1 biscuit and 1 strip of bacon, and then she looked up, and the 3 Whitlock men were not looking at her. Garrett was buttering a biscuit. Hollis was studying the bottom of his coffee cup. Ezra was at the stove, his back turned, stirring something that did not need to be stirred. They had given her the dignity of eating alone in a room full of people, and she felt it like a hand on the small of her back, and she did not know how to thank them for it, and so she said nothing, and she ate the second biscuit. When she set down her fork, Hollis spoke. Miss Ashford, we need to talk about what is to be done with you. Yes. There are 3 things we can do. I will lay them out, and you will choose, and we will do whatever you choose. The first is we put you on a horse this morning, and we ride you down to Silver Creek, and Reverend Pike takes you in at the parsonage until the next eastbound stage runs. That is Tuesday. You would be in Helena by Wednesday night, and on a train by Thursday. You would be back in Boston in 9 days. She set her coffee cup down very carefully. The second is we ride down to Silver Creek today without you, and we sit with Reverend Pike, and we send a wire to Boston, and we find out who wrote that letter you carried out here. While we are doing that, you stay in this house with my brother Ezra, who would no more harm you than he would shoot his own horse, and you wait. When we come back, we know more than we know now. And the third The third is you stay here through the winter until the snow goes out of the high passes in April. You take this room. I sleep in the forge until spring. Garrett and Ezra keep their rooms above the kitchen. You cook what you want to cook and you do what you want to do. And at the end of it in April, we ride you to Helena ourselves and you take a train wherever you want to take a train. And the train can be east or it can be west. And we pay for the ticket and you owe us nothing. Nothing at all. Not a coin. Not a thank you. Not a backward look. She did not answer immediately. She picked up her coffee. She held it. She did not drink. Mr. Whitlock, Hollis, Mr. Whitlock, why would you offer the third? He looked at her then. He looked at her in a way she had not been looked at in 12 years since the last time her father had looked at her across a breakfast table on a morning in 1866. 3 days before he died, she did not flinch. She had been raised not to flinch. Because somebody wants you dead, Miss Ashford, somebody who is not on this mountain, somebody who paid 4 men to be on Crow's Pass at sunrise yesterday. If we put you on the eastbound stage on Tuesday, they will find you in Helena, and they will finish what they paid those men to start. If we send you home to Boston, they will meet you at the door of whatever house you used to live in. The only place in the world where they cannot reach you today is this kitchen. I will not pretend otherwise. I am not in the business of pretending. And in April, La Hollis said, we will know more than we know now. And if they are still hunting you in April, we will know that too. And we will decide together what is done about it together. You will not be sent anywhere you do not choose to go, not from this table, not from this mountain. You have my word. A man keeps his word. She had not been told it yet. She would be told it many times in the coming months by all 3 of them in different voices and at different hours. But she heard it the first time in the way he said the word, and she understood, sitting in the borrowed gray wool dress with bacon grease on her lips, that the Whitlock men did not use the term lightly. She set down her coffee. The third, she said. Hollis nodded once. All right. With conditions. He looked up. Conditions. Mr. Whitlock, I am not a house guest. I am not a charity case. I will not eat your bread and sleep in your dead wife's bed and watch 3 men work a winter homestead from a window seat. I will work. I cook. I sew. I can read a ledger. I have nursed in a charity hospital in Boston for 3 years, and I am not afraid of blood or wound or fever. Your brother is going to teach me to handle a Henry rifle because my Derringer holds 2 rounds. And I have already fired one of them, and I do not intend to keep the other in reserve forever. Your other brother is going to let me read what books are in this house because I have not read a book in 9 days, and I will go mad without one. And you are going to let me into the forge because I have heard a man at his trade is a man at his most honest, and I would like to know what kind of men I am living among. Those are the conditions. The kitchen was very quiet. Garrett had stopped buttering his biscuit. Ezra had set down the wooden spoon. Hollis was looking at her, and there was something at the corner of his mouth that was not a smile because his face did not know how to smile anymore, but it was the place where a smile would have begun. Miss Ashford, he said. Yes, that is acceptable. He stood, he picked up his coffee cup and he carried it to the wash basin and he set it down and he said with his back to the table, Garrett, saddle up. You and I are riding to town. Ezra, show Miss Ashford the house, all of it, including the forge. She wants to see it. She sees it. Hollis, what? The grave. Hollis stopped at the door. He did not turn around. If she wants to see it, she sees it. He went out. A man at the door turning his back is sometimes a kindness, and Eleanor Ashford understood it as one because she had felt all the while she was making her speech the prickle of a tear that had not yet decided whether to fall, and now that he was gone, she let it. One. She wiped it with the back of her wrist before Ezra saw, and she stood up from the table, and she said in the bright, steady voice her aunt had drilled into her since she was 12, Mr. Ezra, show me the house. He showed her the house. He showed her the front room with the stone fireplace his father had laid in 1855 and the deep shelf of books along the western wall that he confessed blushing were mostly his, with a small section of Sarah's at the end that no one had touched in 8 years. He showed her the kitchen with the cast iron stove and the dry larder and the cold larder and the root cellar trapdoor under the rag rug by the back door. He showed her the back porch with the bench his father had built and the long stretch of fenced kitchen garden where the last hardy cabbages stood, frosted under the new snow. He showed her the barn with its 6 horses and its high loft of hay and its tack room smelling of leather and neatsfoot oil, and he showed her the smokehouse hung with 3 deer and 2 elk quarters and a string of curing trout. He named everything. He told her how much a beaver pelt fetched in Helena and how many cords of wood a Whitlock winter ate and how far the nearest neighbors lived, the Hendersons. 7 miles south, a family of 6. He showed her the forge. The forge was Hollis's room. She understood that the moment she ducked under the low lintel and stepped onto the packed dirt floor and smelled the cold iron and the old charcoal and the bear grease Hollis used on the hammer heads to keep them from rusting. It was the room of a man who lived alone. A canvas cot in the corner under one wool blanket, a row of tools hung in perfect order along the back wall, a jar of cold coffee on the brick of the chimney, the anvil in the center, 200 pounds of polished iron with a low wooden stool beside it, and on the stool a small object she did not at first recognize. She crossed the floor. She bent to look. It was a doll, a wooden doll, 6 inches high, hand-carved from a single piece of pine. A girl, a small girl. The face had been worked with a fine knife. The eyes and the mouth and the small straight nose and the hair was suggested by shallow grooves running back from the brow. The doll wore a dress carved into the wood with a tiny carved sash. It was unfinished. The arms had been blocked out but not yet shaped. It had been sitting on that stool, Eleanor understood, for 8 years. She did not touch it. She stood up. She turned to Ezra. He was watching her, his long, careful hands clasped in front of him, his eyes the color of slate. He had Hollis's mouth and Hollis's height in miniature, and none of Hollis's stillness. He was a man who had not yet stopped flinching. Mr. Ezra. Ezra, please. Ezra, the little girl, Lily. He said the name as if he had not said it aloud in a long time. She was 2. She would have been 10 this December. How did she die? She had not meant to ask. She had heard herself ask it. Ezra blinked once slowly, and he looked at the doll on the stool, and he looked back at her, and he made a decision. That is Hollis's to tell, he said, if he tells it. Yes, I am sorry. I should not have. You should have. You live here now. You will hear it or you will not. But the asking is not the wrong of it. He stepped back from the forge door. There is one more place, he said. If you want to see it, I will walk with you if you do. I will not if you do not. She knew what he meant. I want to see it, she said. They walked together through the snow around the side of the barn, past the smokehouse, to the small white-painted picket fence under the Douglas fir. 2 slabs of granite. He had cut them himself, Ezra said quietly. Hollis, with his own hands, in the forge, in the spring after they died. He had not let anyone help him. The slabs read Sarah Whitlock, 1846 to 1870, and Lily Whitlock, 1868 to 1870. Eleanor stood at the fence in the gray wool dress and the new snow with her stocking feet and a borrowed pair of Garrett's old boots because no one had thought yet of finding shoes for her, and she looked at the 2 stones, and she did not pray because she had stopped praying when she was 14, but she stood for a long time in the kind of silence that is not different from prayer. Then she said to the stones, not to Ezra, I am sorry I'm sleeping in your room. I will treat it well. I will not move your things. I will be gone in April. Ezra did not speak. When she turned to go back, she found that her eyes were wet, and Ezra was looking the other way at the timber line at nothing, giving her the same dignity his older brother had given her over breakfast. They walked back to the house in silence. That was the first morning. The first week passed the way first weeks pass on a mountain in small daily increments that did not feel at the time like the building of anything. Hollis and Garrett rode to Silver Creek and back twice. The first time they spoke to Reverend Pike, who confirmed in horrified detail the death and burial of Jeremiah Cole, and who produced from his desk drawer the letter Cole had received the previous May, sent from a Boston broker requesting a young woman of good family who might consent to come west. Cole had answered the letter himself in his own slow hand on the back of an old freight invoice. He had agreed. He had sent $50 by the same post for the purchase of a wedding dress. Then he had gone to hunt elk above the Marias, and he had not come back, and the broker had been written to, and the broker had not answered. Someone, the Reverend said, had intercepted that line of communication and had continued to write to Eleanor Ashford in Jeremiah Cole's name, and to forward the date and the route and the time. Someone in Boston, someone with access to the broker's correspondence. The second time they rode to town, they sent the wire. It went to a man named Hartwell Porter, a lawyer Ezra had known at law school in St. Louis years before, who had since taken a small practice in Helena. Hartwell Porter was, Ezra said, the only man between the Missouri and the Pacific that he would trust with this. The wire requested discreet inquiry into the legal guardianship and financial circumstances of Miss Eleanor Marie Ashford of Beacon Hill, Boston, Massachusetts, with particular attention to the will of her late father, Edward Ashford. While Hollis and Garrett rode to and from town, Eleanor stayed at the house with Ezra, and Eleanor learned the house, and the house slowly learned her. She baked bread, This was unexpected. She had baked once in a Boston charity kitchen under the eye of a nun with an iron will and a wooden spoon, and she had thought she had forgotten everything. She had not forgotten. She produced 4 loaves on her second morning, dark and crusted and slightly uneven on the tops, and she set them on the long pine table, and Garrett came in from the barn and stopped in the doorway and said, his voice strange, "That is wheat bread." "It is." "There has not been wheat bread in this house since." He did not finish the sentence. She did not press him. She mended. This was less surprising. She had been raised with a needle in her hand. She found Hollis's torn work shirts in a basket in the back hall, 8 years of accumulated tear and rip and missing button, and she sat by the fire in the front room in the evenings and she stitched them. He did not thank her. He did not say anything. He came down to breakfast on the morning of her 5th day, and he was wearing a blue cotton shirt with all of its buttons, the cuffs neatly turned back, and he looked at his sleeve once, and he looked at her once, and he poured his coffee. She read. Ezra had not exaggerated the shelf. There were 140 books on the western wall of the front room, and she counted them. There was Hawthorne, there was Dickens, there was a battered Marcus Aurelius in Latin that she lifted down on her second night and read by the fire. And Ezra came in from the kitchen with 2 cups of tea and stopped in the doorway and saw her with the book open across her lap, and his face did something he had not let it do in a long time. "Latin," he said. "My father insisted. I had to teach myself in St. Louis. I never had it right. Then I will read it to you if you would like. After supper, the way I read it to my father, he used to make me read him a page each evening before bed. I've not had anyone to read it to in 12 years. Ezra sat down on the hearth bench. "I would be obliged," he said. She shot. That was the 4th day. Garrett took her out behind the barn after the noon meal in the new snow with the long Henry repeating rifle that had been his father's, and he set up 6 tin cans on a stump at 30 yards, and he showed her how to seat the stock against her shoulder, and he warned her about the kick. He warned her 3 times. She held the rifle. She breathed out. She put the first can off the stump on the first shot and the second on the second shot, and Garrett, who had ridden 3 years for the cavalry and who did not impress easily, stood beside her with his arms folded and watched her place the 3rd and the 4th and the 5th. And he said, when she lowered the rifle, "Miss Ashford?" "Yes." "Where did you learn that?" "My aunt," she said, "a woman who could not shoot was a woman waiting to be a victim. She started me at 14 with a target pistol in our back garden in Beacon Hill. The neighbors complained. She did not care." "Your aunt?" "Yes, the same aunt. The same aunt." Garrett did not say anything for a moment. Then he reached out and took the Henry from her, and he checked the action, and he set it carefully against the side of the barn. "That is a complicated woman," he said. "She is a wicked woman, Mr. Whitlock. She raised me in a house with a music tutor and a Latin master and a target pistol because she did not want me to be soft. But she did not raise me because she loved me. She raised me because my father died and left her an investment, and the investment had a name, and the name was Eleanor." Garrett looked at her for a long moment. "What investment?" he said. She told him. She told him in the snow behind the barn with the cold wind moving through the timber and the smell of wood smoke from the cabin chimney and the sound of Ezra splitting kindling somewhere out of sight. And she told him in the same level voice she had used over breakfast on her first morning, because Garrett was not Hollis and she did not yet know how to tell Hollis, and Garrett was kind, and Garrett was a man who had ridden for the cavalry, and Garrett would know what to do with information. $200,000 in trust from her father, dead 12 years, to be released on her 25th birthday, which was the 14th of February of next year, held in guardianship until that date by her aunt, Margaret Ashworth Whitfield of Beacon Hill, Boston. Should she die before her 25th birthday, the entire sum principal and interest reverted to Margaret. Garrett did not speak for a long time. "How many months?" he finally said. 3 months and 11 days from today. "Miss Ashford." "I know. Your aunt. I know." Does Hollis know?" "I have not told Hollis." "You need to tell Hollis." "I am going to tell Hollis tonight after supper. I needed to tell someone first to hear myself say it out loud, to know that when I say it to him, I will not break." Garrett looked at her then in a way she would remember for a long time. "Miss Ashford," he said. "Yes, you are not going to break." She told Hollis after supper. She told him in the front room by the fire with Ezra and Garrett both there, because she had decided in the course of the afternoon that it was a story that belonged to all three of them now, and she did not want to make any of them carry it alone. She told it in 20 minutes. She told it without flinching. She told them about her father and about the trust and about the date and about the aunt who had taught her to shoot in a back garden in Beacon Hill. And she ended with the letter inside her bodice and the dead man on Crow's Pass. And when she was done, she sat with her hands folded in her lap in the borrowed gray wool dress, and she waited. Hollis did not speak for a long time. He sat in his father's chair by the fire, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands hanging loose between them. The firelight moved on the side of his face. She studied his jaw, and she did not look at his eyes. Miss Ashford, he said, Eleanor, please, if we are going to do this together, I cannot keep being Miss Ashford. The name is too tall a wall. Eleanor, yes. Your aunt is the one who paid for those men on the pass. Yes. And she is the one who wrote the letter in Cole's name. I believe so. And she is by way of being your legal guardian until your birthday in February, the one person in the world who, if you die before that day, becomes a very rich woman. Yes. And we are between this evening and the 14th of February, the three men standing between her and $200,000. Yes. Hollis looked into the fire. Eleanor. Yes. That changes nothing. She had braced for it. She had thought in the slow walk back from the barn that afternoon that the moment they understood the size of the money, they would put her back on a horse. The Whitlock brothers were honorable men. She had decided that already. They were also human men, and $200,000 was a sum that turned honorable men into other kinds of men, sometimes in her experience. She had braced for it. She had not braced for him to say it changed nothing. Hollis, what? I do not want you to fight her for me. I want you to know that if at any point in the winter you decide the cost is too high, I want you to put me on a horse and let me ride out, and I will go to San Francisco, and I will disappear into a different name, and I will live on what I can earn, and you will hear from me when I am safe. He looked up at her then. Eleanor, he said. Yes. That is not how this works. Hollis. That is not how this works. You did not come up onto this mountain because you wanted to. You did not put on my wife's dress because you wanted to. You did not lose Coleman Bevins on a stage road in a country you have never seen because you wanted to. You came up here because somebody put you here on purpose, and the somebody is sitting in a townhouse in Beacon Hill tonight, drinking a glass of sherry and waiting for a wire that says you are dead. We are not going to send her that wire. We are going to send her a different one, and we are going to send it in our own time and in our own words, and you are going to be sitting at this table when we send it. That is how this works. The fire popped. Ezra on the hearth bench with his Latin Aurelius open in his lap did not look up. Garrett in the chair by the window did not look up. Neither brother moved. A man keeps his word. She heard it again, although Hollis had not said it. She rose from her chair. She crossed the room. She stood in front of Hollis Whitlock by the fire, and he stood too, because a man stood when a woman approached him, even in a mountain cabin in Montana Territory in the autumn of 1878. And she put her hand on his sleeve. Just her hand, just the sleeve, the first deliberate touch she had given him. Thank you, she said. He did not answer. He did not have to. She went up to bed. That night, for the first time, she did not bolt the door. She had not bolted it the first night either, but the first night she had been too tired to think. This night she was not tired. This night she stood for a long minute with her hand on the iron bolt, and she thought about it, and she decided deliberately that the bolt would stay open, and she crossed the room and got into bed in Sarah Whitlock's nightgown that Ezra had quietly laid at the foot of her bed on the second day, freshly laundered and smelling of cedar, and she put out the lamp. She slept. In the kitchen below, Hollis Whitlock sat at the long pine table with his brothers, and they did not speak for a long time, and finally Garrett said, "She did not tell me about the wire to Hartwell Porter. I will tell her tomorrow." "You will tell her tonight. She is asleep. You will tell her tomorrow at breakfast. The first thing, before the coffee. She is one of us now, and she does not learn things from us in second hand. She is not one of us." Hollis. "What?" "She is one of us." Hollis looked at his middle brother across the table, and Garrett looked back, and Ezra at the end of the table said nothing because nothing needed to be said, and the three Whitlock men sat in the kitchen of their father's house, and they understood, all three of them at once, that a thing had shifted somewhere in the timbers of the cabin over the course of the past 7 days, and that the shift was not going to shift back. Outside, the snow was no longer falling. The night sky over Crow's Pass had cleared. 1,000 miles to the east, on a train moving west through Iowa, a man in a dark suit named Theodore Hayes sat in a private compartment with a folio of papers across his knees, and he read by the yellow light of the brass oil lamp on the wall, and he made a small note in pencil at the bottom of the third page, and the note was a date, and the date was the 17th of November. He had 3 weeks. He intended to be on the mountain by then. The first 3 weeks of November moved over the Whitlock cabin the way the first 3 weeks of November have always moved over a mountain. The snow that had fallen on the morning of Eleanor's arrival did not melt. A second snow came down on the 8th, a third heavier on the 14th. By the third week of the month, the upper meadow was 18 inches deep. The Douglas fir under which Sarah and Lily slept wore a thick white skirt to its lower branches, and the trail down to Silver Creek had narrowed to a single line of beaten path. The brothers broke open every other morning with the snowshoes their father had stretched in 1854. Eleanor learned the snowshoes. She learned them the way she had learned the rifle, quietly, methodically in the small hours after breakfast when the men were at their work. Garrett took her out on her first pair on the 7th of November in a fall of light powder, and she fell 6 times in the first 100 yards, and she did not curse, and she did not laugh, and she stood up each time and adjusted the rawhide bindings the way he had shown her and walked on. By the 12th, she could keep up with Ezra to the wood lot. By the 18th, she could break trail herself for 200 yards before tiring. Garrett, walking behind her on the morning of the 19th, watched her plant her left snowshoe, lift the right plant, the right lift the left, and he said to no one in particular, "She is a Whitlock." She was not a Whitlock, but there were 3 men on the mountain who were beginning to think she might be one, and one of them was beginning to think it more than the other 2, and that one was Hollis, and Hollis had not yet said it to himself in words. What he had said to her on the morning of the 11th was that he had sent a wire to Hartwell Porter. He said it at breakfast the way Garrett had told him to before the coffee. He laid the cup down empty, and he said, "Eleanor, I wired a man in Helena about your father's trust, a man Ezra knew at law school. He is a lawyer named Hartwell Porter. He has a small practice on Last Chance Gulch. He is making inquiry into the will, into your aunt's guardianship, and into anyone in Boston who has access to your father's broker. We will know more before Christmas. I should have told you sooner. I did not. I am telling you now." She put down her fork. Thank you for telling me. That is all I have to say about it. Hollis, what? That is the first time you have called me Eleanor without my asking you to. He looked at her across the table. He did not answer. Ezra at the stove turned a strip of bacon. Garrett at the wash basin did not turn around. The kitchen was quiet for the length of a long breath, and then Hollis lifted his coffee cup and Eleanor lifted hers, and the morning went on. There were many such mornings. She read Marcus Aurelius aloud to Ezra after supper on the evenings he asked. She did not read it on the evenings he did not ask. She learned which evenings he asked and which evenings he did not, and she understood somewhere in the second week that the evenings he did not ask were the evenings he had ridden down to the lower trap line and seen something on the trail that had reminded him of the spring of 70 when he had been 19 and his hands had not been steady, and a woman he loved like a sister had been bleeding on the floor of the kitchen where he now scrambled eggs. On those evenings he sat on the hearth bench and stared into the fire, and Eleanor read silently to herself, and that was a kind of reading too. She mended every torn thing in the house. When she ran out of torn things, she asked Garrett if he had anything that needed mending, and Garrett rummaged in his trunk and produced a wool blanket coat from his cavalry days, 1872. By the date stitched inside the collar with a long, ragged tear down the right sleeve from a piece of barbed wire he had hit at a hard run somewhere south of the Yellowstone in the spring of 74. She mended the coat. She mended it so well that Garrett, putting it on for the first time the next morning, ran his hand down the sleeve and could not find the line of the tear. And he looked up at her at the breakfast table and said, "Miss Ashford, where is the seam?" "I doubled it under and turned it twice." "Where is the seam?" "Run your thumb along the inside of the cuff." He ran his thumb along the inside of the cuff. He felt the small ridge of her work. "Miss Ashford." "Eleanor, please, we have been over this." "Eleanor, this is better than the original." "Yes." "You did this last night by lamplight." "Yes." Garrett shook his head. He did not say anything else. He drank his coffee. But the next morning when she came down for breakfast, there was a small carved wooden hair comb on her place at the table. Pine, the carving was rough, but the lines were clean. A small flower at the wide end. Ezra's work. Garrett had asked him to make it. Eleanor understood. She did not say anything. She picked the comb up and she pinned her hair back with it and she wore it the rest of the day. And Ezra looked at the comb in her hair across the supper table that night and did not speak. And Garrett looked at Ezra not speaking and almost smiled. And Hollis at the head of the table watched all of it, and Hollis did not eat his second biscuit. She went into the forge. She had not gone in since Ezra's tour. She had told herself she would not go in. The forge was Hollis's room, and she had no business in the room of a man who slept there because he did not want to sleep under the same roof as her, even with a flight of stairs and a bolt and the long memory of his dead wife between them. She had been very clear with herself about this. She went in on the morning of the 20th. She did not mean to. She had been carrying a basket of mending out to the barn where Ezra had asked her to leave it on his workbench, and she had passed the forge door at the moment Hollis had set down his hammer to bank the fire, and she had heard through the open door a small sound she did not at first recognize. A humming, a man humming low, almost under his breath, the way a man hums to himself when he is alone and absorbed in his work. She stopped on the path. She had not heard Hollis make a sound that was not a word in 3 weeks. She set down the basket. She walked the 4 paces to the forge door. She did not knock because she did not know what to knock for, and she stood in the doorway and watched him. He had his back to her. He was at the anvil in shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. Despite the cold, a leather apron tied at his waist. He held a length of red-hot iron and tongs, and he was drawing it out under the hammer. 3 quick taps and 1 ringing strike, 3 taps and 1 strike, and the rhythm of it was the rhythm he was humming, and the iron was bending into a curve under his hand, the way a sentence bends into meaning under a careful pen. And she understood, watching him, that she was looking at the most articulate thing he did. He knew she was there. She did not know how she knew that he knew, but she knew. He did not turn around. He finished the curve. He plunged the iron into the slack tub in a cloud of steam. He set the tongs down. He wiped his forearm across his brow. Then he turned. Eleanor, I am sorry. I did not mean to interrupt. You did not interrupt. I will go. Stay if you like. She stayed. She stood inside the doorway and watched him work the rest of the morning. He shaped 2 hinges for the Henderson family 7 miles south, who had ordered them in October. He mended a broken plow handle for the Walker homestead on the North Fork. He did not speak. She did not speak. The forge smelled of charcoal and hot iron and bear grease, and the cold smell of snow drifting through the gaps in the chinking. And somewhere in the second hour, she sat down on the low wooden stool beside the anvil, the stool where the small, unfinished pine doll had sat for 8 years, and she realized only after she had sat down that the doll was no longer there. The doll was on the chimney shelf above the forge, set carefully against the brick where the heat would not reach it. He had moved it. She did not ask when. She did not ask why. She sat on the stool and she watched him work, and at some point late in the morning, he glanced at her and he said, without breaking the cadence of the hammer, "You sit easy in here." I like the sound. What sound? The hammer. It is steady. There are not many steady sounds in the world. He did not answer for a moment. Then he said, "No, there are not." When she went out at noon to help Ezra with the dinner, she did not realize until she was already in the kitchen that she had sat in the forge for 3 hours and had not once thought of Boston or her aunt or the man on a westbound train. The man on the westbound train arrived in Helena on the 18th. They did not know it yet. The wire from Hartwell Porter reached Silver Creek on the 20th the same morning. Eleanor sat down on the stool in the forge, and Garrett rode down to fetch it on the 21st. He came back at full dark with the temperature falling and a wind picking up out of the northwest that would bring fresh snow before midnight, and he came into the kitchen and stamped his boots and did not take off his coat. Hollis? What? Out here. The brothers went out onto the back porch. Eleanor heard the door close. She heard their boots on the boards. She heard the low murmur of Garrett's voice and the lower murmur of Hollis's. She did not move from the table. Ezra, across from her, looked once at the back door and once at her, and he said very quietly, "Eleanor." "Yes." "Whatever it is." "Yes." "Whatever it is, you are not alone with it." She nodded. She did not trust her voice. The brothers came back inside. Hollis carried the folded wire in his hand. He sat down at the head of the table. He did not unfold the wire. He looked at Eleanor. "Hartwell Porter has answered." "Yes." "Your aunt is in Helena." She had braced for words. She had thought she had braced for any words. She had not braced for those. "In Helena." She arrived on the 18th. She is staying at the Grand Central Hotel. She has retained a lawyer named James Whitaker out of Boston who came west with her. She has filed a petition with the territorial court alleging that her ward, Miss Eleanor Marie Ashford, has been abducted from her stagecoach near Crow's Pass on the 4th of October by 3 persons known locally as the Whitlock brothers and held against her will at a remote homestead in the Bitterroot Mountains. She has petitioned for the immediate return of her ward to lawful guardianship pending the resolution of her father's estate. The petition has been received by Judge Pratt of the Federal District. A preliminary hearing has been set for the 5th of December. Eleanor sat very still. The 5th? 2 weeks. That is 2 weeks. She put her hands flat on the table. She put them flat because her aunt had once told her in a different life that a woman who has been hit with a blow puts her hands flat on the nearest surface and breathes out twice before she speaks. And she breathed out twice and she said, "What else? There is more. Tell me." She has retained an attorney here in Silver Creek as well, a man named Theodore Hayes. Hayes is not from Silver Creek. He arrived from Boston by way of Helena on the morning of the 20th. Yesterday, he took a room at the boarding house on Front Street. He has been asking questions. Reverend Pike sent word up the trail with the boy who carries the post. Hayes has been asking who the Whitlocks are, what we trade in, who we owe money to, and whether any of us has a history of violence in the territory. And does any of us have a history of violence in the territory? Hollis looked at her. "I do," he said. She waited. "Bozeman, 1866. I was 19 years old. I broke a man's jaw in a saloon and put him through a window. He had said a thing about a woman that he should not have said. The woman was my mother. She had been buried 6 months. I did not know him. He did not know me. He survived. I did not stand trial because the saloon keeper testified the man had drawn first, and I had not drawn at all. But there is a record. Hayes will find it. It will not look like nothing." "It will not look like nothing." Eleanor took her hands off the table. "Hollis." "What?" "He is coming up here." "Yes." "When?" "Tomorrow, day after. He is timing his ride to the weather. He will want to come with a deputy or a marshal at his side. There is no federal marshal in Silver Creek. The nearest is in Helena and is currently occupied with the trial of the men who robbed the Northern Pacific paymaster in September. Hayes will not get a marshal. He will come with 2 hired men out of Helena. Reverend Pike has heard the names. They are not Silver Creek men. They are not honest men." Garrett by the door said, "3 guns." "3 guns," Hollis said. "Mine, yours, Ezra's, and mine." It was Eleanor who said it. The 3 brothers looked at her. "I am not a guest at this table," she said. "I have said it before. I will say it again. If men with rifles ride up that trail to take me out of this house, they will find 4 guns on this mountain, and one of them will be mine. I shot a man on the 4th of October because he came at me with a knife. I will shoot a man on the 24th of November because he comes with a writ. The writ does not change the shape of what he is. He is a man taking a woman against her will. I have already given my answer to such men once. I will give it again. I will not be made to repeat myself a 3rd time." The kitchen was very quiet. Hollis Whitlock looked at her across the long pine table, and the firelight moved on the side of his face, and he said, "Eleanor, yes, that is acceptable." He did not smile. He did not have to. They prepared. They prepared the rest of the night, and they prepared into the next morning. Garrett took the 2 best rifles down from the rack over the front door and oiled them at the kitchen table. Ezra went to the root cellar and brought up 4 boxes of brass cartridges and laid them in a row on the sideboard. Hollis went out to the forge and did not come back for 2 hours. And when he came back, he carried a small object wrapped in oiled cloth, and he set it on the table in front of Eleanor and did not unwrap it. She unwrapped it. It was a Colt peacemaker. Cleaned oiled the cylinder loaded with 5 rounds and the hammer down on an empty chamber the way a man carried a Colt who did not intend to shoot himself in the foot, drawing it from a holster. "This is mine. This is yours." "Hollis, I shaped the grip down for a smaller hand last night. After supper, I should have asked you first about the wood. It is walnut. If you do not like walnut, I will do it in oak." She did not answer. She did not answer because she could not. She picked up the Colt. The grip fit her hand the way no firearm had ever fit her hand. The walnut had been smoothed and oiled until it caught the lamplight like skin. She felt very low in her chest, the small tearing sensation that comes when a person who has not been cared for in a very long time understands that they are being cared for and does not yet have a vocabulary for the sensation. "Hollis, what? Thank you." He went out to the back porch and did not come back for some time. The wire from Hayes came in the morning. It came up the mountain in the hand of the same boy who carried the post, a 14-year-old named Jeb Carmody, whose father drove freight for the Silver Creek Mercantile, and Jeb rode up through new snow on a tough little mountain pony and dismounted in the yard and handed the wire to Garrett with both hands the way he had been taught to hand a folded paper to a grown man. Garrett gave him a silver dollar and a cup of coffee and sent him into the kitchen to thaw. He carried the wire to the front room himself. Hollis read it aloud. Mr. Whitlock, stop. I am Theodore Hayes, attorney for Mrs. Margaret Ashworth Whitfield of Boston. Stop. I will arrive at your homestead the morning of the 24th instant with company. Stop. I bear a petition from the territorial court for the temporary recovery of one Miss Eleanor Marie Ashford, pending hearing in Helena on the 5th of December. Stop. Refusal to surrender said person will be reported to the court and may result in criminal charges, including abduction. Stop. Cooperate, and the matter ends quietly. Stop. Resist, and the matter ends otherwise. Stop. Theodore Hayes, Esquire. Hollis folded the wire. He did not speak. Eleanor said, "Read me the part about cooperate again." He read it again. Cooperate, and the matter ends quietly. Resist, and the matter ends otherwise. He is telling us we will die if we do not give me up. Yes. He is telling it to us in writing with his name signed to it on a wire that has passed through 2 telegraph offices and a postal carrier. Yes, he is not very careful, is he? Garrett by the window made a small sound that was nearly a laugh. "He is a Boston lawyer," Garrett said. "He has not been on a mountain in November before." "Then we are going to teach him." Hayes came on the 24th. He came at 10:30 in the morning, 3 hours later than he had threatened, because the trail up from Silver Creek had taken him longer than he had expected, and his city horse had thrown a shoe at the 8-mile mark, and the smaller of his 2 hired men had fallen twice in the deep snow and had to be helped up by the larger one. Hayes himself rode a tall bay gelding that had been sold to him in Helena as a mountain horse and was no such thing, and Hayes was wet to the knee, and Hayes was furious, and Hayes did not realize, riding into the upper meadow of the Whitlock homestead at the head of his small, unhappy column, that he had been watched from the timberline for the last 2 miles by a man with a Henry repeating rifle laid across the fork of a lodgepole pine, and that the man was Garrett Whitlock, and that the only reason Theodore Hayes, Esquire, was riding into the dooryard of the cabin alive was that Garrett had not yet been given the signal to make him otherwise. The signal would be Hollis's to give. Hollis stood on the porch. He stood on the porch in his work shirt and his canvas coat, no hat, no gun visible, his hands easy at his sides. Eleanor stood in the front room behind him, 10 feet back from the open door, the Colt at her hip in a holster Hollis had cut for her out of an old saddle skirt the night before. Ezra was in the kitchen with the back door braced and the kitchen window open 1 inch and the second Henry rifle laid on the windowsill on a folded rag to keep the cold of the metal from showing in the snowlight. Garrett in the timber had a clean line of fire to the dooryard at 140 yards. There were 3 men in the yard. Hayes was small. He was perhaps 5'7". He wore a black wool greatcoat and a black bowler hat, and his face was the color of cold dough, except where the wind had whipped his cheeks raw. He drew rein 20 feet from the porch. His 2 hired men sat their horses behind him, hard-faced, the kind of men who do not look at one another because they have already had every conversation that men of their kind ever have. One held a Winchester across his pommel. The other had a Colt at his hip and his hand resting on the grip. "Mr. Whitlock." "Mr. Hayes, you received my wire." "I did." "Then you know my purpose." "I know your stated purpose." Hayes did not like that. His mouth tightened. He produced from inside his greatcoat a folded paper sealed with a red wax seal, and he held it out across the distance between the porch and his horse, and he said, "The petition signed by Judge Pratt of the Federal District of Montana Territory. It commands the temporary surrender of Miss Eleanor Ashford to my lawful custody as the representative of her legal guardian pending the hearing on the 5th of December. Refusal is a federal matter." Hollis did not move. "Mr. Hayes." "What?" "Step down off that horse and bring me the petition. I will not take a paper across 20 feet of snow. If it is a lawful paper, I will hold it in my own hand." Hayes hesitated. Hayes had not planned on dismounting. Hayes had planned on receiving the surrender of a frightened young woman across the saddle horn of a tall bay gelding and riding out before the noon meal. Hayes had not planned on being told by a mountain man in a canvas coat with no visible weapon to dismount in 18 inches of snow in front of two hired killers and walk forward alone. He dismounted. He walked forward. His boots were not winter boots. The snow came in over the tops at the third step. By the fifth step, he was unhappy. By the porch, he was deeply unhappy. And the wax seal on the petition was beginning to soften from the warmth of his hand. He held the petition up. Hollis took it. Hollis broke the seal. Hollis unfolded the paper and read it slowly, the way a man reads a paper he intends to know every line of. He folded it back up. Mr. Hayes. Mr. Whitlock. This paper is signed by Judge Pratt. It is. Judge Pratt is, I am told, an honest man. He is the senior federal judge of this territory. Then I will tell you what I will do with this paper. I will keep it. I will bring it with me in my own hand to the hearing on the 5th of December. I will ride into Helena on the 3rd. I will stand in Judge Pratt's court with Miss Ashford at my side, lawfully and freely, and I will allow Miss Ashford to speak for herself about her custody and her safety and her wishes, and I will allow the court to determine the truth of the matter on the basis of what a grown woman of 24 years says in her own voice. That is not the petition. It is not. The petition commands her surrender today. It does. Then you are refusing the petition. I am modifying the petition. The court will decide whether the modification stands. If Judge Pratt rules I have acted unlawfully, he will issue a warrant, and a federal marshal will ride up this mountain in the spring, and I will go peaceably with him to Helena. That is a matter of 2 weeks. Miss Ashford will be safer in this cabin for those 2 weeks than she would be in any room in Helena that you arrange for her. I am not going to surrender her to you today, not to you, not to those two men behind you, not for any paper signed by any judge until I have spoken with the judge myself. Hayes's face changed. Mr. Whitlock, you are making a grave error. Perhaps. My men, your men. My men are not patient men. Mr. Hayes. What? There is a man in the timber north of this house with a Henry rifle. He has had a sight picture on the bridge of your nose since you came over the rise. There is a second rifle in the kitchen window behind me. The hammer is back. The shooter is 27 years old and reads Marcus Aurelius in the original Latin and has not raised his voice once in the 13 years I have known him as a grown man, and he is the brother who will end you and your two friends here before you finish drawing breath if either of those men behind you moves a hand toward a holster. Tell them now, slow, without turning your head. Hayes's mouth opened, Hayes's mouth closed. Hayes did not turn his head. Hayes lifted his voice careful level, and he said, "Boys, hands flat on the saddle horns. Both of you." Now, the two hired men put their hands flat on their saddle horns. In the timber line, Garrett Whitlock sighting along the long blue barrel of his father's. Henry eased his finger off the trigger, the eighth of an inch, no more. "Mr. Hayes," Hollis said. "Yes." "You will mount your horse, you will ride back down to Silver Creek, you will send word to your client in Helena that Miss Ashford will be in Judge Pratt's courtroom on the 5th of December in the company of 3 Whitlock men, and that she will speak for herself. You will not return to this mountain. You will not send another man up this trail. If you do, the next conversation we have will not include any paper from any judge. Do you understand me?" "I understand you." "Repeat it back, Mr. Whitlock. Repeat it back." Hayes repeated it back. He repeated it back word for word in the cold and the deep snow in his unsuitable boots with the wax seal melting against his palm. Then he turned and he walked back to his bay gelding and he mounted, and he and his 2 hired men rode out of the upper meadow of the Whitlock homestead in single file, slow hands visible until the trail bent into the timber a quarter mile out, at which point Hollis heard faintly Hayes spurring his horse into a hard trot down the mountain. Hollis did not move from the porch for 10 minutes. When at last he turned and went into the cabin, Eleanor was still standing in the front room. Her hand had not left the grip of the Colt. Her face had not moved. He closed the door behind himself, slow, and he set the bar across it, and he turned, and Eleanor Ashford crossed the front room in 4 steps and put her forehead against his chest and stood there. She did not weep. She did not speak. She stood with her forehead against the wool of his coat, and she breathed in once, twice, 3 times. He did not put his arms around her. He did not know what to do with his hands. After a moment, he laid one of them very lightly on the back of her hair where she had pinned the small pine comb Ezra had made. He held it there. In the kitchen, Ezra eased the hammer of the Henry rifle down off full cock and laid the rifle on the floor under the window and put his face in his hands for a moment and breathed. In the timber line, Garrett climbed down out of his lodge pole and walked back toward the cabin in the unbroken snow, and he was halfway across the meadow when he saw through the front window of the cabin his older brother standing in the front room with his hand on the back of a woman's head, and he stopped walking and he stood in the meadow in the snow, and he did not start walking again until he had counted slowly to 30 because he was a Whitlock man, and Whitlock men gave one another the privacies they needed. That night at supper, no one mentioned Theodore Hayes. They ate, they drank coffee. Ezra read aloud from a letter Hartwell Porter had sent up the mountain that afternoon by the same boy who had carried Jeb Carmody's wire that morning. The letter was 3 pages long, and it was in Hartwell's neat lawyer's hand, and it contained on the second page a small piece of news that none of them had expected. Eleanor's father had not written his will alone. He had written it with a witness. The witness had been a woman in Boston, a widow of a senator, a friend of Eleanor's mother from a long time ago, a woman who had not yet been heard from in this matter and whose name was Catherine Harrington. Hartwell Porter had written to her. Hartwell Porter had received a reply. Catherine Harrington was at this writing, boarding a westbound train. Hollis folded the letter. He set it down on the table. He looked across the lamplight at Eleanor, and Eleanor looked back, and outside the cabin the wind picked up off the high ridge, and the first hard storm of the winter began to come in, and in the forge across the yard the small unfinished pine doll sat on the chimney shelf above the cold iron where a man had moved it 3 weeks before and would not this winter or any winter to come move back. The storm that came in that night was the first hard storm of the season, and it held the cabin in its teeth for 3 days. It came down out of the north in great gray sheets that wrapped the upper meadow until the barn was a shadow 70 feet from the back porch, and the Douglas fir under which Sarah and Lily slept was not visible at all. The brothers could not run the trap line. They could not break trail to the woodlot. They could only keep the stove fed and the horses watered and the cabin warm, and that took the 4 of them working in shifts from before dawn until after dark, and that left a great deal of evening when there was nothing to do but sit in the front room and listen to the wind try to come in through the chinking. On the second night of the storm, Hollis told her he had not planned to tell her. He had told himself for 3 weeks that he would not tell her that the story belonged to him and to Garrett and to Ezra and to 2 slabs of granite under a fir tree, and that no other person living needed to carry it. He had been wrong about that, and he had known he was wrong about that since the morning she had stood at the picket fence and stocking feet and spoken to the stones, and on the second night of the storm, he stopped lying to himself about it. He found her in the front room. She was alone. Garrett was in the barn checking the horses one last time before he came in for the night. Ezra was in the kitchen banking the stove. Eleanor sat by the fire with a wool shawl across her shoulders and a book she was not reading open in her lap, and she looked up when Hollis came in, and she did not ask why he was there because she could see in his face that he had come for a reason. He sat down in his father's chair across from her. He looked at the fire for a long time. Eleanor. Yes. You asked Ezra once how she died. The book slid down a 1/4 inch in her lap. She did not move to catch it. Well, yes. He did not tell you because it was not his to tell. Yes. I am going to tell you. She set the book aside. She folded her hands. She did not speak. She had learned in 3 weeks under his roof that when Hollis Whitlock chose to give her words, the right thing to do with the words was let them come. It was the spring of 70, and he said, we had wintered hard. The previous fall had been thin on game. There had been a band of men in the country that winter, 8 or 9 of them, no settled trade, working the high creeks for what beaver they could trap and selling out of Silver Creek when they had pelts and drinking the money when they did not. They had come to the homestead twice that winter to ask for grain and for whiskey. My father had been dead 3 years. I was 23. I had a wife of 2 years and a child of 2. I was the man of this place, and I had run those men off the porch both times. I had not been gentle about it. They had not liked it. He stopped. He looked into the fire. In the spring, Garrett and I rode east to Helena to sell what furs we had taken. It was 4 days riding and 2 days at the trading house and 4 days back. 10 days. Ezra was 19. He had come home from his second year of law in St. Louis only the month before. He stayed at the cabin with Sarah and Lily. He had a rifle, but he was not a man who had ever shot a man. He had been raised gentle. That was my doing. I had wanted one of us raised gentle. She did not move. They came on the 4th day, Hollis said. 4 of them, the 4 worst. They had been drinking since Silver Creek, and they were past drunk by the time they reached the meadow. They came to ask for grain. Sarah was at the door. She told them no. They were not in any condition to hear no. One of them put his hand on her. Ezra came out of the kitchen with the Spencer carbine our father had left him. He shot one of them dead on the porch. He shot the second one in the doorway as he came through. The third one fired back from the yard, and the bullet did not hit Ezra. It hit Lily. She was 3 feet behind him. She had come down from the loft when she heard her mother's voice rise. The fire popped. She did not die there, Hollis said. I want you to know that she did not die on the porch. The bullet took her in the side. Ezra and Sarah carried her to the kitchen. The fourth man rode out without firing. The third man bled out in the yard. Sarah and Ezra worked on Lily for 2 days. They could not stop the bleeding inside of her. She died on the morning of the third day. I rode in that afternoon. Garrett behind me by an hour. We had heard the gunfire from the lower ridge, and we had come up at a run, and the horses were lathered to the shoulder when we hit the meadow. I came into the kitchen, and my daughter was wrapped in a wool blanket, the wrong color, and my wife was on the floor with her hands in her lap, and Ezra was bleeding from his eye where the second man had hit him with the butt of a rifle going down, and my brother could not get the words out. He could not say what had happened. He stood in the corner of the kitchen, and he opened his mouth, and no sound came. He was 19 years old, and he had killed 2 men to save my wife and my daughter, and he could not in the end save my daughter, and he could not tell me he could not save my daughter. He drew a long breath. Sarah did not die that day. I want you to know that too. Sarah lived through that summer. She lived through the autumn. She did not speak much. She did not eat much. She sat by the fire in the same chair where I am sitting now, and she stared at the window. In the late autumn, she developed a cough. By Christmas, the cough was in her lungs. By February, the doctor in Silver Creek came up the mountain and listened to her breathing and shook his head. He called it consumption. He had seen a great deal of it. He said it took the weak and the grieving, and Sarah Whitlock was both. He gave us laudanum, and he said to keep her warm, and he rode back down the mountain. She died in this room on the 11th of March of that year, 8 months after Lily. I held her hand. She was 40 pounds lighter than she had been the day I married her. Her last word was not a word. It was a sound. I will not say what the sound was. I have not said it aloud since. He looked at Eleanor. That is how she died. He said, Lily by a stray ball in 70, Sarah by consumption 9 months after. Not by her own hand. I want you to know that too. There have been people in Silver Creek over the years who have said things. I have not corrected them. I have not corrected them because the truth was no business of theirs. The truth is yours now because you are sleeping in her bed, and you have a right to know whose room you are sleeping in and whose dress you wore the first morning and what kind of grief lives in the wood of this house. You have a right to know that the bolt on the door was tested last spring because for a year I had thought about asking a woman from Helena to come up and keep house, and I had wanted her to know the bolt worked. I did not ask the woman. I do not think I ever meant to, but the bolt was tested and it works. He stopped. He had not spoken that many sentences at once in 8 years. Eleanor did not speak. She did not weep. She had not wept yet in any room of this cabin. She rose slowly, and she crossed the 4 feet between her chair and his, and she knelt in front of him by the fire, and she took his hands, both of them, the great calloused hands the size of dinner plates, and she pressed her forehead against them. She stayed there a long time. She did not speak because she understood that any word she gave him in that moment would be a smaller thing than the silence she could give him instead, and she had been raised by a man who taught her that silences had different sizes, and that the largest of them was a kind of love. When at last she lifted her head, his hands were wet. She had not realized she had wept until then. Hollis, Eleanor, thank you for telling me. You asked once. I did. I should have told you that night. You told me tonight. That is when you could. That is the right night. The wind pressed against the cabin walls. In the kitchen, Ezra had stopped moving. He was standing with his hand on the stove lid, his head turned just slightly toward the front room, and he had been standing that way for some minutes. In the yard, Garrett, coming back from the barn, had paused at the back porch step, had stamped his boots once, and had then waited a long time before opening the door because he had heard faintly his older brother's voice telling a story, and Garrett, who had not heard his older brother tell that story in 8 years, had stood in the cold and let him tell it. When Garrett finally came in, neither he nor Ezra said anything. That was the second night of the storm. The storm broke on the morning of the 27th, and a rider came up the trail. He came up alone on a tall gray mare that knew its work, and he wore a heavy gray coat and a black wool hat pulled low, and he was a man, not a woman, but the woman was 20 minutes behind him on a hired buggy with 2 trunks and a driver out of Silver Creek who had agreed for a price to break trail through the new snow. The rider was Hartwell Porter. He swung down at the porch and shook Ezra's hand and Garrett's hand and Hollis's hand in that order, and he took off his hat and stood in the front room and rubbed feeling back into his face, and he said, "Mrs. Harrington is 20 minutes behind me. She insisted I ride ahead. She wanted you to have warning. She said a woman of 57 does not arrive unannounced at a stranger's door." "She is at Silver Creek already," Hollis said. "She arrived yesterday on the eastbound train. She would not stop at the parsonage. She slept 3 hours and hired the buggy at first light. I rode out to meet her at the foot of the trail. I have been with her since." Hartwell. Hollis. What does she know? Everything that I know, which is most of it. The will, the trust, Margaret, the letter from Boston, the death of Jeremiah Cole, the petition, the hearing on the 5th. She has corroborating papers. She has a deposition from a clerk in the office of Edward Ashford's broker confirming that Margaret has had access to that correspondence for the past 3 years. She has letters from Edward to her written in the year before he died expressing fear for what Margaret might do to Eleanor after his death. She has signed those letters into evidence in the form of a sworn affidavit witnessed by a federal judge in Massachusetts, sealed and certified. She has in short broken the case. Hollis sat down at the kitchen table. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "Why has she come?" Hartwell Porter sat down across from him. "Because she loved Eleanor's mother," Hartwell said, "and because she has been waiting 12 years to do this, and because when I wrote her 2 weeks ago, she sent me back a wire that said she would arrive on the 27th of November and that she would not be turned away, and she has not been." Catherine Harrington arrived on the porch 18 minutes later. She was a small woman dressed in dark gray traveling clothes with iron in her hair and iron in her bearing, and the kind of carriage that comes from 30 years of marriage to a man who had stood on the floor of the United States Senate and lost more debates than he had won and had not been broken by any of them. She did not weep when she saw Eleanor. Eleanor did not weep either. The two women stood for a long moment in the front room of the Whitlock cabin, and Catherine Harrington crossed it in 3 steps and took Eleanor's face in her hands and looked at her, and she said, "Child, you have your mother's mouth. I have been told, I have not seen it in 22 years. I have not seen her in 15. Then we will sit," Catherine said, "and we will talk, and we will tell every man at this table what he needs to know, and we will go to Helena together on the 3rd of December, and we will end this." She sat. She told it all. She told it in the front room with the fire built up and the wind dying outside, and she told it in the careful sentences of a woman who had been a senator's wife and had learned to give testimony before her husband had ever asked her to. Edward Ashford had not trusted his sister Margaret. He had said so to Catherine in 1862, 4 years before he died when Eleanor was 8 years old. He had set up the trust 3 years later with provisions designed in his own careful hand to put $200,000 beyond his sister's reach for as long as possible. He had given the guardianship to Margaret only because the laws of Massachusetts required a legal guardian and there had been no other relation. He had told Catherine on a winter afternoon in 1865, 6 months before his death, that he believed Margaret would attempt to take the money one way or another. And he had told Catherine that if anything happened to Eleanor between his death and her 25th birthday, she was to bring forward the letters he had written her. And she had agreed, and she had kept the letters in a locked drawer of her writing desk in Boston for 12 years, and she had now brought them west in a leather portfolio she now produced and laid on the table. She opened the portfolio. The first letter was dated October 1866. It was in Edward Ashford's hand. The hand was firm and elegant and unmistakably his. Hartwell Porter, who had compared it against the original will, held in the Federal Records Office in Helena, confirmed the match. The letter read in part, "Catherine, my dear friend, I am not a man given to imaginings, but I have observed my sister this past year, and I am persuaded she has a design upon my daughter's inheritance, which she means to carry out by means I cannot bring myself to write here. If I am gone before Eleanor is of age, watch her. If she is harmed, speak." Eleanor read the letter twice. She did not weep. She had wept her tears 2 nights ago by the fire, and she did not have more for tonight. She handed the letter to Hollis, and Hollis read it once slowly, and he handed it to Hartwell, and Hartwell put it back in the portfolio with the others. "There are 6, Catherine said, all in the same hand, all over a period of 2 years, all saying in different words the same thing. They are devastating." "They are evidence," Hartwell said. "They are both," Catherine said. "And we will use them in the courtroom of Judge Pratt on the 5th of December, and Margaret Ashworth Whitfield will not walk out of that courtroom as a free woman." Hollis looked across the table at Eleanor. He looked at her for a long moment. "Eleanor, yes, there is something else we have to talk about before we ride to Helena." She knew what it was. She had known perhaps since the night of the petition. She had known since the day he had set the Colt Peacemaker with the walnut grip on the table in front of her. She had known in the deepest way since the morning she had stood at the picket fence and spoken to two stones in the snow. But she had not let herself think it in words, and now Hollis was about to think it in words. And she sat at the table in the front room of the cabin she had been brought to in a borrowed bison robe, and she waited. He did not say it in front of Hartwell and Catherine. He waited until they had been shown to their rooms, the small spare room above the kitchen for Hartwell, the larger guest room on the same floor for Catherine, and the cabin had quieted for the night, and only the two of them sat by the fire in the front room with cold coffee in their cups. Then he said it. Eleanor, Ezra has been reading the territorial statutes for 2 days now. He says there is a thing we can do. There is a way by the laws of Montana Territory that we can put you beyond the reach of your aunt's guardianship before we ride into Judge Pratt's court. The laws of Massachusetts say you are a ward until you are 25. The laws of Montana say that a married woman of any age over 18 is a person before the law in her own right, with property of her own and standing of her own. If you marry in this territory before the 5th of December, your aunt has no further legal claim on your person. The hearing becomes a matter of contested guardianship over a married woman of 24 and a married woman of 24 with witnesses and evidence, and a defense attorney of Hartwell Porter's caliber will not lose. She did not answer. She waited. Eleanor. Yes. I am not asking you to marry me because I love you. She looked at him. I am not asking you to marry me because I do not love you either. I am not putting that question to you in this room tonight. That is a question for another room and another night, and I will not poison it by mixing it with the law. I am asking you because you are in danger, and a piece of paper signed by Reverend Pike on the 2nd of December at the parsonage in Silver Creek will end the danger faster than any courtroom in Helena will. And if at the end of all of this you wish the paper undone, I will sign whatever is needed to undo it, and I will not hold you to it, and you will go to San Francisco or to Boston or to any place under the sun that you wish to go, and you will go with my blessing and with whatever you ask of this house to take with you. I am asking for the use of my name. Nothing more, nothing else. That is the question, and that is the only question, and I would like you to take whatever time you need to answer it. She did not take time. She set down her coffee cup. Hollis? Yes. I will marry you on the 2nd of December, Eleanor. I have one condition. Name it. That when the time comes in another room and on another night that you have a different question to put to me, you put it. He looked at her across the firelight. He did not smile because his face still did not know how to smile, but the place at the corner of his mouth where a smile might have begun moved, and she saw it move. That is acceptable, he said. She put her hand on his sleeve. She left it there. They were married on the morning of the 2nd of December in the small Methodist parsonage at Silver Creek by Reverend Jeremiah Pike, with Garrett and Ezra and Hartwell Porter and Catherine Harrington as witnesses, and with no music and no flowers and no ring, because there had been no time to make a ring, although Hollis Whitlock had spent 2 hours the night before at his forge shaping a thin band of silver from a coin his father had carried since the war, and the band was in his coat pocket as Eleanor Ashford stood beside him in her crimson traveling dress, mended and pressed and worn for the first time since the morning on Crow's Pass, and Reverend Pike asked the questions, and they answered. And at the moment Reverend Pike pronounced them married, Hollis Whitlock turned to his wife and slid the silver band onto her finger, and the band fit because he had measured her hand against his thumb 100 times in the past week and had not been wrong. He kissed her once. It was a small kiss, a kiss in front of witnesses, a kiss that was a public matter and not the kiss that was coming in some other room on some other night when he had a different question to put to her. But it was warm and it was sure, and she felt the brush of his beard against her cheek and the steadiness of his hand at the small of her back, and she understood that whatever followed this had been a real thing, and a real thing was a thing that could not be undone. They rode out for Helena the next morning. The hearing took 3 days. It took 3 days because James Whitaker, the lawyer Margaret had brought from Boston, was a thorough man and an able one, and he fought for every inch of ground from the first opening statement to the last. He fought for the validity of the Massachusetts guardianship. He fought for the legitimacy of Margaret's petition. He fought on the second day with an argument so fine it was almost beautiful for the proposition that the marriage of Eleanor Ashford to Hollis Whitlock at Silver Creek on the 2nd of December was a sham marriage entered into for the express purpose of evading the lawful authority of a Massachusetts court, and was therefore void as a matter of public policy. He lost on every point. He lost the guardianship argument because Hartwell Porter produced on the morning of the first day the affidavits of Catherine Harrington and the deposition of the clerk from Edward Ashford's broker and the 6 letters in Edward Ashford's own hand. He lost the petition argument because Hartwell Porter produced on the afternoon of the first day the wire from Theodore Hayes that read, "Cooperate and the matter ends quietly, resist and the matter ends otherwise," and Judge Pratt, who had been a federal judge for 14 years and who had read a great many wires from a great many lawyers, read this wire twice and looked at Theodore Hayes across the courtroom and asked Theodore Hayes if he had written it, and Theodore Hayes admitted that he had, and Judge Pratt struck the petition that afternoon and made a note on his bench that he would forward the wire to the territorial bar. He lost the sham marriage argument because Eleanor Ashford Whitlock took the stand on the morning of the second day. She wore the gray wool dress. She had not worn the crimson dress to court. The crimson dress had been her wedding dress, and the crimson dress would stay her wedding dress. And the dress that walked into Judge Pratt's courtroom on the morning of the second day was the plain working dress of a married woman of the Montana Territory. And the woman who walked in it stood 5 feet 3 inches tall and held her shoulders the way her aunt had taught her to hold them. And she put her hand on the Bible and she swore to tell the truth. And then she told it. She told them about Crow's Pass. She told them about Coleman Bevins. She told them about the 4 men. She told them about the derringer in her sleeve. She told them about Hollis Whitlock kneeling in the road. She told them about the bison robe and the silver hairbrush and the bed she had slept in. She told them about the morning she had come downstairs in stocking feet and asked for a Henry rifle and a place in the forge. She told them about the storm that had held them for 3 days, and the night Hollis had told her how Sarah and Lily had died, and the next morning she had risen and gone into the forge and stood beside her husband while he worked, and had understood watching him that she had married him already in some quieter room of her own heart, long before they had stood in the parsonage at Silver Creek. James Whittaker rose to cross-examine her. He did not finish his first question. She turned to him on the witness stand and she said very quietly, "Mr. Whittaker, you will ask me whether I love my husband. I will save you the trouble. I do. I will save you a second question. I would have married him if there had been no aunt and no petition and no inheritance. I will save you a third question. I am not afraid of you, and I am not afraid of my aunt, and I would not have crossed 2,000 miles of country and shot a man on a mountain pass and learned to break trail in snowshoes and slept under the roof of 3 Whitlock men through a winter storm only to lie about it now in this courtroom. Ask me anything you like. I will answer plain, but you will not unmake what was made in that parsonage on the 2nd of December, because what was made there was the small public part of a thing that was already true, and a thing that is already true cannot be unmade by a Boston lawyer." The courtroom was quiet. James Whittaker sat down. He did not stand again. On the morning of the third day, Judge Pratt issued his ruling. He issued it in 14 sentences, and the 14 sentences set forth the following findings: that Margaret Ashworth Whitfield had conspired by hired agents to bring about the death of her niece, Eleanor Ashford Whitlock, for the purpose of inheriting the trust established by Edward Ashford; that she had caused to be written by an intermediary in Boston a series of letters in the name of one Jeremiah Cole, deceased, for the purpose of inducing the said Eleanor Ashford to travel into the territories; that she had retained the services of Theodore Hayes, Esquire, for the purpose of pursuing said petition under threat of violence in defiance of all standards of the bar; that on the basis of these findings she would be remanded into federal custody for transport back to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to answer for the conspiracy; that all guardianship of Eleanor Ashford Whitlock was by the same ruling dissolved; that the trust established by Edward Ashford in 1865 would be released to Eleanor Ashford Whitlock at her own discretion to do with as she pleased on the day she presented herself at the Helena office of the Federal Bank with proof of identity. Margaret Ashworth Whitfield did not speak as she was led out. She did not look at Eleanor. She looked at Catherine Harrington once, and the look had something old and tired in it, the look of a woman who has gambled large and lost, and Catherine did not look away, and Margaret was the one who broke the look, and then she was gone. Eleanor and Hollis stepped out of the courtroom into the noon light of Last Chance Gulch. Judge Pratt sent a clerk after them. The clerk caught them at the foot of the courthouse steps. He bore a folded note from the judge. Hollis read it. He read it twice. He folded it back up. "He wants to see us in chambers," he said. Why?" "He has a proposal." The proposal was this: the $200,000 belonged to Eleanor Whitlock free and clear. She could do with it whatever she wished. But Judge Pratt, who had been a federal judge for 14 years and had seen many things suggested with the warmth of a man who had no stake in the matter, that she consider establishing an independent trust administered by the federal bank in Helena under the supervision of his own court for the use of any children she and her husband might have, with the principal to be distributed to those children on attainment of their majority, and with neither Eleanor nor Hollis to draw upon it for any purpose during their joint lives. He suggested it because he knew, he said, that there would be those in Helena and Silver Creek and across the territory who would say that Hollis Whitlock had married a wealthy Boston woman for her money, and he knew it would be a lie. And he knew that the cleanest way to put the lie to rest was to put the money beyond the reach of either of them. Eleanor looked at Hollis. Hollis looked at Eleanor. "My daughter is not for sale," Hollis said. "Nor any daughter we may yet have," Eleanor said. They signed the papers that afternoon. The trust was established in the names of the unborn children of Hollis and Eleanor Whitlock, and the principal of $200,000 passed out of Eleanor's hands the same hour it had come into them, and she walked out of the Federal Bank in Helena on the afternoon of the 7th of December, 1878, with nothing in her pocket but the silver wedding band on her finger, and she walked out feeling for the first time in her adult life that she owned every inch of her own self. They rode home through new snow. Catherine Harrington stayed in Helena to settle the legal residue. Hartwell Porter rode with her to assist. Hayes had already disappeared, gone east on the second train, out his license to practice law in any territory soon to be a matter of public record. The four travelers who rode out of Helena on the morning of the 8th of December were Hollis Whitlock, Eleanor Whitlock, Garrett Whitlock, and Ezra Whitlock, and they rode in a line through the upper valley with the sun on the snow and the air bright as struck flint, and they came home to the upper meadow of the Whitlock homestead at full dark on the evening of the 10th. The cabin was cold when they came in. Hollis stoked the stove. Garrett saw to the horses. Ezra carried in the trunks and the new bolt of red flannel and the 4 boxes of brass cartridges and the 2 sacks of coffee Hollis had bought in Helena, and he stowed them in the larder. And he came back into the front room and he looked at Hollis and Eleanor standing by the fire, and he understood the way Ezra had always understood things, that there were rooms a man went into and rooms a man left alone. And he picked up his Marcus Aurelius from the hearth bench and he said, "I will sleep in the loft above the barn tonight, Garrett and I both. The barn is warm. The horses have new hay." He went out without waiting for an answer. Hollis looked at his wife. His wife. He had not said the word in his own head until that moment. Eleanor. Yes. There was a question I was going to put to you in another room on another night. There was. This is another room. This is another night. She crossed to him. She took his hands, the great calloused hands that had set her on a horse, and built a Colt peacemaker for her own hand, and shaped a silver wedding band from a coin his father had carried, and she pressed them between her own. "Ask," she said. He asked, she answered. The fire burned low through the night, and somewhere in the darkest hour the snow began again on the meadow and on the Douglas fir under which Sarah and Lily slept, and on the slate roof of the forge where the small unfinished pine doll sat on the chimney shelf above the cold iron, and Hollis Whitlock in the room above the kitchen that had been his wife's room and was now his wife's room again, in the bed in which a woman he had loved had once slept, and in which a woman he was learning to love now slept, closed a door against the wind. And by the morning that broke pale and clear over the upper meadow of the Whitlock homestead, the room above the kitchen was no longer Sarah Whitlock's room and no longer Eleanor Ashford's room. It was the room of a man and his wife. That winter passed. It passed the way mountain winters pass, in cords of wood and pots of stew and snow shoveled from porches, and pots of coffee at midnight when a calf came hard. By April, the trail to Silver Creek was passable again. By May, the meadow had begun to green. By July, Eleanor Whitlock was carrying a child. She did not tell Hollis the way she had planned to tell him. She had planned to tell him at supper with Garrett and Ezra, present, the way the news of an inheritance had been told and the news of a hearing had been told, because the news of a child was a news that belonged to all 3 brothers and not only to a husband. She had planned the words. She had practiced them. But when the morning came, she did not plan and she did not practice. She walked out to the forge in the early light in her gray wool dress that no longer fit at the waist, and she stood in the doorway of the forge until Hollis turned from the anvil and she said, "Hollis, yes. In February." He set down the hammer. He looked at her. He did not move for the length of 3 breaths. Then he crossed the floor of the forge in 3 strides, and he gathered her into his arms, and he did not weep, because Hollis Whitlock had not wept since the night of the second storm, and would not weep again that morning. But he held her with both his arms and his face against her hair, and after a long moment he said, "Eleanor." "Yes." You're home now, right where you're supposed to be. The child was a girl. She came on the 11th of January in 1883, weeks early in the deep cold of a winter storm, not unlike the one that had broken over the cabin the year before. Garrett rode for the midwife in Silver Creek and got there and back through 18 miles of bad snow in 14 hours, which was a thing only Garrett Whitlock could have done and survived. Ezra boiled water and split kindling and read his Latin Aurelius in the front room because he did not know what else to do with his hands. Hollis sat by the bed and held his wife's hand and did not let go of it for 9 hours, and when at last the child was put into Eleanor's arms, she looked down at the small red face and the small dark fuzz of hair and the small slate gray eyes that were already, the midwife said, beginning to turn, and she said to Hollis very quietly, "What shall we name her?" "That is yours to name." "No, that is ours to name. I have a name. You tell me whether it is the right name." "Tell me." "Hope," she said, and for her second name, Lillian. Hollis did not speak for a long moment. When he did, his voice was rough. "That is the right name. For both of them. For all three of them." He kissed his wife on the forehead, and he kissed his daughter on the forehead, and he went downstairs, and he stepped out the back kitchen door into the cold, and he stood in the snow under the Douglas fir, and he said aloud to no one and to everyone the name of his first daughter and the name of his second wife and the name of his second daughter, and he said them in the order they had come to him, and he stood under the fir tree for a long time after that, and when at last he came back inside, his face was wet, and he did not pretend otherwise. 22 years passed. They passed the way years pass on a mountain that has been chosen. The seasons came, the seasons went. The forge fire was banked at the end of every day and lit again at the beginning of every next one. Wheat bread sat on the table 4 mornings a week. Marcus Aurelius was read aloud by lamplight in the front room 3 winters out of 4, with first one voice reading and then another, until in time it was small voices reading and then larger voices and then larger ones still. Hope Lillian Whitlock learned to ride at 4. Hollis James Whitlock II was born in the spring of 1882. Sarah May Whitlock was born in the autumn of 1885, and Eleanor had asked Hollis what she might name a second daughter, and Hollis had said, "There is one name in this house that has not yet been given to a living child," and Eleanor had wept, and the name had been given. Edward Garrett Whitlock came along in 1888, named for Eleanor's father and her middle brother-in-law, and was the last. Garrett Whitlock married Adelaide Henderson, the second daughter of the family, 7 miles south, in the autumn of 79, 6 months before Hope was born, and built a cabin a half mile down the meadow. And over the next 12 years, he and Adelaide had 5 children of their own, 3 boys and 2 girls, all of them with the lean Whitlock face and the same long, quiet hands. Ezra Whitlock did not marry for many years. In the summer of 1885, he traveled east to Boston on a matter of legal business for Hartwell Porter, and there he renewed his acquaintance with Catherine Harrington, then 64 years old, and the two of them found that the long correspondence they had maintained since the winter of 78 had grown into a thing for which neither had a name. They were married quietly in Boston the following spring. Catherine came west with him to the Whitlock homestead and lived in a small cabin Ezra built her at the head of the upper meadow, with a window that faced east and a wood stove that Ezra tended himself, and she read by the fire and helped Eleanor with the children and corresponded with her friends in Boston, and she lived 12 good years on the mountain before her heart gave out in the winter of 98. Ezra buried her himself in a small plot beside the Douglas fir, with her granite stone cut and dressed in the Whitlock forge by Hollis's hand. And he never married again, and he did not seem unhappy. He served as justice of the peace for the Upper Bitterroot country for the last 14 years of his life, and was known across the territory as a fair man. Margaret Ashworth Whitfield died in a Massachusetts prison in the spring of 1880, 15 months after her sentencing of a failed heart and a failed life. Catherine wrote to inform Eleanor of the death. Eleanor read the letter at the kitchen table, and she folded it once, and she set it aside, and she went on stirring the pot of stew on the stove, and she did not weep, and she did not speak of her aunt again for many years. The trust established for the Whitlock children grew in the safe care of the Federal Bank in Helena, and was distributed in equal portions to Hope on her 21st birthday, to Hollis James Jr. on his, to Sarah May on hers, and to Edward Garrett on his. None of the 4 needed it for survival. The Whitlock homestead by the turn of the century was 400 head of beef cattle and a working forge and a wheat field along Crow Creek, and a small school in the front room where Eleanor Whitlock taught reading and writing and Latin and natural science to 9 children of the Upper Bitterroot country every weekday morning from 8 until noon. She had taught for 18 years. By the autumn of 1900, she had taught Hope and Hollis Jr. and Sarah May and Edward Garrett. She had taught the 5 Whitlock cousins from down the meadow. She had taught the children of the Henderson family and the children of the Walker family and the children of 2 new families who had come into the country in the 80s. She had taught them by the fire in the front room, and she had taught them well. Hollis Whitlock turned 53 on the 7th of June, 1900. He looked older than that and younger than that in the way that men who have spent their lives outdoors and used their hands for a living tend to look. His hair had gone silver at the temples by his 45th year and dark brown in between, and it had stayed that way. His shoulders had not narrowed. The scar from the shoulder injury he had taken in the spring of 1879 when 3 men had come back up the trail in a last attempt at retribution after Margaret's sentencing, and the brothers had ridden them down and ended the matter, had healed clean and was a thin white line in the meat of his upper arm that he sometimes rubbed in the cold weather. He had carried his wife up the porch step in his arms on the morning of every one of their wedding anniversaries for 22 years, even the year Hope was 8 months in the womb, and Eleanor would protest and he would not put her down until they were inside. And that had become a thing the children laughed about, and that the grandchildren, when they were old enough to laugh about anything, came to laugh about too. There were 6 grandchildren by the autumn of 1900. Hope had married a young doctor in Helena in the spring of 99 and was expecting her first that winter. Hollis Jr. was reading law at the University of St. Louis and had not yet married. Sarah May was 15 and rode like a Whitlock and was already the best horsewoman in the upper Bitterroot. Edward Garrett was 12 and was, his mother said, the funniest of the 4 children, with a wit that came from neither parent and that they could not account for. On an afternoon in October of that year, Hollis Whitlock said to his wife, Eleanor, I want to ride up to the ridge. She looked at him over the rim of her teacup. Which ridge? The high one, the one we have not climbed. She knew which ridge. She had known him for 22 years, and she had never asked him to ride up that ridge because that ridge was the ridge on which he had stood in the spring of 1868 and had said his marriage vows to a young woman named Sarah May Brennan, and he had not climbed that ridge in 32 years. Yes, she said, will you come with me? I will come with you. They rode out the next morning. Sarah May, 15, was at the school where her brother Edward Garrett was finishing his Latin lesson with the Walker children. Hope was in Helena. Hollis Jr. was in St. Louis. Garrett was working the lower pasture with his oldest boy. Ezra was in his cabin with a stack of legal papers from Hartwell Porter, who at 70 was still the busiest lawyer in Last Chance Gulch. The ridge climbed for 2 hours through the timber. It came out at last on a rocky shoulder of bare granite from which a man could see 90 miles on a clear day, the same kind of saddle that Crow's Pass had been, only higher and further north, with the Bitterroot Mountains rolling away to the southwest in long blue waves. Below them, in the bowl of the upper meadow, the Whitlock homestead lay small as a child's toy, with smoke rising from 3 chimneys and the figures of children running between the school and the corral and the bright thread of Crow Creek catching the sun. They sat down on a flat rock at the edge of the saddle. He took her hand. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Hollis? Yes. Do you miss Sarah? Every day, less than I did, less than I have in years, but every day. That is the right answer. It is the only answer I have. Then it is the right one. He squeezed her hand. She rested her head against his shoulder. She had been doing it for 22 years. She had been doing it since the night of the second storm. She had been doing it since the morning the door of Theodore Hayes had been closed in the front room of the cabin, and she had crossed the front room in 4 steps and put her forehead against his chest. She did it now. Eleanor, yes. Look down there. She looked. That is what we built. That is what we built. With these hands. With those hands. Built this with our own hands. She lifted her head and looked at him, and the amber eyes were the same eyes that had looked at her in the road on the morning of the 4th of October, 1878, when she had pointed a derringer at his chest and told him she had 1 round and would use it. The eyes were older now. There was silver in the beard around them. There were lines at the corners that the wind and the weather had laid down through 22 winters, but the eyes were the same. Do you remember, she said, the morning on Crow's Pass? I remember every minute of it. I remember a young woman of 24 sitting in the dirt of the trail in a crimson dress with 1 bullet in a derringer and the body of a stage driver beside her, and believing when she heard your boot on the trail that the day she had been born for had come, and the day was the day she was going to die. I remember 22 years later, I sat in this meadow with you yesterday and watched our daughter Sarah May teach her cousin to braid a horse's mane, and watched our son Edward Garrett read out his Latin lesson to the Walker children, and watched Garrett come up the meadow from the lower pasture with his oldest boy. and watched Ezra come down from his cabin with a basket of bread for the table. And I thought in that moment the same thing I have thought 1,000 times in 22 years. The day on Crow's Pass was not the day I was going to die. The day on Crow's Pass was the day my life began. He did not answer. He did not have to answer. He drew her against him, and he held her on the ridge in the long autumn light, and below them in the meadow the smoke rose from 3 chimneys, and the bright thread of Crow Creek caught the sun, and somewhere down there a child was laughing, and somewhere down there a hammer was ringing on an anvil in a forge his father had built and his brother had inherited, and his son might inherit after that. And the wind moved in the high timber the way it had moved in the lodgepole pines on the morning of the 4th of October, 1878, when Hollis Whitlock had drawn rein on the trail to Crow's Pass and heard for the first time in 8 years a woman cry out. He had thought on that morning that the cry was a cry for help. He had been wrong about that. The cry had been an invitation. He had not known the word for it then. He had not had the language for it. He had only known that he could not ride past, and he had not ridden past, and 1,000 small decisions over 22 years had followed from that one decision, and the decisions had built a homestead and a marriage and 4 children and 6 grandchildren and a school and a wheat field and a small cabin at the head of the upper meadow where his brother had loved a senator's widow until her heart had failed, and the homestead and the marriage and the children and the grandchildren and the school and the wheat field and the cabin had all been built with their own hands, the way the cabin he had been born in had been built by his father's hands, the way his father had taught him and his brothers. A man builds the world he wishes to live in. A man keeps his word. He had kept his. She had kept hers. They sat on the ridge until the sun touched the western bitter roots, and then he stood and he helped her to her feet, and they walked back to where they had hobbled the horses, and they mounted and they rode down the long trail to the homestead. And the homestead was lit warm in the long blue dusk, and somewhere a child saw them coming and called out, and somewhere a door opened and a voice answered, and Eleanor Whitlock riding a quarter length behind her husband down a trail they had ridden together 1,000 times, said in a voice the wind almost carried away but did not quite, "Winter always ends." Hollis Whitlock turned in his saddle. He looked back at her, his wife of 22 years, and counting the mother of his 4 living children and the grandmother of his 6, the woman in the crimson dress who had become the woman in the gray wool and was now the woman who would become in time the woman in the silver hair beside him at the long pine table where they had sat the first morning where they would sit, yet many mornings to come. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very simply, "Yes, it does," and they rode the rest of the way home.